We're glad that you can be here, and those of you that are online virtually, we're glad that you can be here, and that's the reason we made this the absolute most complicated it could be, is we wanted everyone that wanted to be here today could be here today. But MTSS is something that, you know how it is when you're facing things out in a district, it's almost like popcorn. The people start mentioning ideas that, hey, we need help with this or that or the other, and so MTSS is kind of popcorn like that, and we feel like, of course, that's because of pandemic, and so I'm going to call this almost like a revival today for tiered systems of support. And so we know about RTI, but MTSS kind of became more hatched or more developed during the pandemic, and then with the social emotional learning, and then trying to meet all the developmental needs of students. MTSS has kind of become to the forefront as a way to possibly do that and revive our efforts in that. And so here at KVEC, we're thankful that Megan Martin of University of Louisville, Jan Sellers of the Kentucky Department of Education has graced us with their presence today, because in Kentucky, we know MTSS is a national movement. We're seeing that across the nation, but in Kentucky, these two would be what I would consider definitely two experts in that field. And so we're thankful to have them today. But on behalf of the KVEC region, the folks in the room and those virtually, we welcome you to KVEC.
We are very excited to be here today to work with you in your district around building an understanding of a common language, around a multi-tiered system of supports, around Kentucky's framework and those essential elements that we feel are needed to build an effective system. We're going to dig a little deeper today throughout the day into those elements, and we'll give you time to break out in teams to process and discuss, and have some team time at the end of the day. Again, you can scan this barcode. It's the sign-in sheet, so make sure that everybody has signed in. So just briefly, I'm going to talk about today's purpose, and again, we are learning about Kentucky's framework for a multi-tiered system of support. We're going to share with you some resources to support implementation, whether you are building that system, whether you are expanding or enhancing it, or whether you're working towards sustainability. By the end of the day, we'd like you to be able to describe the benefits of an integrated multi-tiered system of support. We'd like you to be able to identify the 6 elements that we consider essential to Kentucky's framework, and we'd also like you to be able to utilize some key resources. We'll give you an opportunity to work with some of those today, and I'll also share with you where you can find additional supports to help you with your implementation. So our agenda for today, I just kind of briefly went over that a minute ago. We're going to just overview what we mean by Kentucky's multi-tiered system of support. We're going to go into a little more detail on each of those 6 essential elements. We'll cover some of them this morning. We'll do a few after we break for lunch. Then we're going to give you some time to look at what it actually takes for implementation, some action planning, some next steps for you as a district, and we'll save time at the end of the day where you can have some team time and really dig into what you want to take back to your district or school. So logistics for today, we talked about the folder. All of the resources you're going to need for today are in that participant folder. We'll have a copy of the slide deck. And again, those guided notes, we'll be using those throughout the day. So we do have paper copies on your table. You can also use the electronic copy. What we'd ask you to do as we're talking, just jot down some of those key ideas or some major concepts that resonate with you, maybe some questions that you have and some next steps that you want to talk about when you come back and work as your team. And then when we put you in those team times or breakout activities, we'll ask you again to just sort of process that and talk about some possible next steps. I also want to talk to you about where you can find some resources. And one of the things that we released this April is a new website. You can access that by going to kymtss.org. Many of you maybe have already been on it and are familiar with it, but this is going to be your one-stop shop for all things MTSS. And so I'm going to take you through just a little bit about what that looks like. Okay, I need to see the website because I'm going to take you guys through a little bit of how that is set up. What we'd like you to be able to do with that is it's really replacing, if you remember, we had guidance from KDE a number of years ago called the Kentucky System of Intervention. We have evolved through that through the years to expanding that framework. And so the resources, the guides, the tools, the information on the website is going to replace that for you. It's more interactive. We feel like we can update it, keep information current for you, and add the information we need as we need it. So what you'll do is when you come to the website, our homepage, if you scroll down the homepage, you'll see how KDE's vision aligns with the key elements of MTSS. Scroll further down, you'll see our definition and purpose. You can click on the overview or the why to get to more information, or you can also use the navigation pane at the top of the page. If you scroll further down, you'll see the logo, you'll see the 6 essential elements. Each one of those, if you click on one of those elements, and you can click on one if you'd like, and it's going to take you to a page of an overview of the element, why we consider it essential to an effective MTSS framework, and then as you scroll down, you'll see key features of implementation, and those are all organized around key systems, data, and practices that would support that particular element of an MTSS framework. So our hope is that as you're kind of identifying things and digging deeper into these this content today, as you're identifying areas that maybe are strengths for you, kind of go in and look and see that things are being implemented as the research shows is effective, or maybe you'll identify an area that you want to tweak or dig into a little bit more. The other place you can go is when you're on these pages, you can scroll down to the bottom, and there is a link to the resources and tools that align to that particular element. You can also go to the navigation bar at the top of the page and go to the resource library, and you'll see a drop-down box for all of the resources there. So I'm going to ask you just to go and click on the resources for collaborative problem-solving teams. Most of these are organized the same way. We feature some resources. Typically, these are ones that we think are good getting started resources, and as we put new resources on the page, that's where they will be featured for the next few months. As you scroll down, the resources are organized into things you need to know about building that particular element. So for collaborative teams, you can see it's all about alignment, teaming structures, and responsibilities. So as we dig a little deeper again into these elements throughout the day, think about where the resources are. Be sure to check those out as you work in your teams. We do have a newsletter that comes out monthly, and at the top of the page you can see the sign up. So please, if you haven't already, sign up for the newsletter. That is how we'll let you know that we are adding new resources to the site, and we'll let you any of the upcoming trainings or anything that we think is significantly to support your work would be in the newsletter. And of course you can always contact us by clicking the Contact Us button. So I think those are the main things I wanted to just give you an overview of so that you know how to access the information that you need. Okay, so we can go back to the PowerPoint. Back one. Okay. And one of the resources I do want to call your attention to, you all are really the first ones that I'm talking to people about, is we did just add a new implementation guide. And this is going to give you a little more in-depth information about the reasoning behind a multi-tiered system of support that's an integrated model. It's also going to let you dive a little bit deeper into each one of those essential elements. I will just let you know it is not designed to read cover to cover. It is something that really is just a resource for you as a district or school as you're identifying an area you want to develop, enhance, sustain, dig a little deeper into. So that's a new resource for you that just got added to the site last week. So now I just kind of want to talk to you about what we mean by a multi-tiered system of support in Kentucky. And what we have done is we've really expanded that framework for response to intervention to a more comprehensive multi-tiered system of support. We're still talking about a multi-level prevention system. So we're looking at prevention at all 3 tiers. What we do for all students, what we do for some students, what we do for those few students who need more intensive intervention. Really, at its core, the base is a strong foundation at Tier 1. We're also looking at it from that whole child lens. So it integrates academic achievement, positive behavior, and social emotional wellness. And it's all accomplished through building an integration of differentiated core instruction, assessment, and intervention. So again, we look at this as the common message that we'd like to make sure that we are communicating to our schools and districts as we really look at an evolution over time from moving from academic response to intervention to an integrated academic and behavior model from the old KSI into integrating the social emotional wellness into the framework. And why are we doing this? What's the purpose behind it? We really find that if we look at an integrated framework, it's really more efficient, it's more effective, it actually is more equitable, and it's a more sustainable use of our resources. What we're looking at is integrating those various multi-tiered systems, academic RTI, PBIS. We're integrating those under one comprehensive framework to look at that whole child and make sure that we're doing that through our integrated teams, our integrated data, our integrated evidence-based practices. And those initiatives that are constantly coming to the forefront and things that we've identified that we need, our integrated school mental health, our trauma-informed practices, our social emotional learning. Instead of building separate teams and separate data pathways and separate practices, we want to be integrating those so we're not working in silos, so that we're not working on those parallel paths with minimal communication between the teams. And so this is a structure that focuses on really organizing that into one comprehensive, cohesive framework. Again, the message we want to communicate out in our schools and districts, because we don't want people to see this as something that's different. It's really taking what you have, it's leveraging your existing system and building onto it, enhancing it, adding to it to support the whole child. I'm really not good with this. I apologize, guys. And what the 6 essential elements that we have identified, these are what we consider essential for an effective implementation of a multi-tiered system of supports. So you can see each of those are the ones that we're going to be going through in more depth today, give you time to discuss and talk about in your teams. So I want to talk about these just briefly in terms of the way we have them represented on our graphic. When we talk about equitable access and opportunity, we represent that on the graphic as surrounding the entire framework. It's really built into every single thing we do, at every tier, and with every other element. At the heart of the system is that familiar triangle to represent that multi-level prevention system, those 3 tiers of support, but we surround that with the domains of social, emotional, academic, and behavior. It's really just representing the fact that we want this framework to support the whole child. And so as you're looking at initiatives and systems that you already have in place, how can you integrate those under this cohesive framework? The 4 elements that surround the framework in the middle, these are really also interconnected. They exist at every level of the system, the district, the school, teacher level, and individual student level. At all levels, we have those collaborative problem-solving teams. We're all using the data from our comprehensive screening and assessment system to make data-informed decisions. And we're selecting, based on the data, those evidence-based practices, whether it's for instruction, intervention, or supports. Always, again, with that whole child in mind. And then we really are valuing and encouraging the partnerships in this effort among families, school, and community. So that sort of is the whirlwind tour of what it is and the why behind it. I'm going to give you a few minutes. We'd like you to take about 5 minutes in your teams and just kind of process what you heard. If you haven't had a chance, jot down some things on your graphic organizer, some big ideas or things that you may want to take back with you to your school or district. And as you're thinking about what we just talked about today, jot down some of those ideas, talk among your team, process that information, and maybe think of some next steps for you as a district or school.
So if we could all come back together. I know we've moved around a little bit and shifted tables to make sure our teams are together. Okay, Jan, you want to follow up?
Sure. I thought I would just check and see what questions you might have, or if there was anything that came up that you needed clarification, or even if you wanted to share some of the next steps that you talked about at your table.
We did have one question, Jan. It was, is the implementation guide posted on the site yet?
Yes, it is. It is
Okay.
on the site.
Can you give them a little guidance on to where that is?
Yes, you'll find it under the resource library when you go to that drop-down box, and it actually is the first resource in the library. You click on that and it'll open up a PDF. It's actually right now the only thing on the site, well, not the only thing, but it is, you can download it and print it if you wanted to. Did that clarify where you can find it, or?
Yes.
Okay.
So any big questions that came out of that section? Just the overview of the new definition, Kentucky's new state definition, the new purpose, any questions? It's too early for everybody to be asking questions, right? Any big rocks or big ideas? Anything that you saw that was different than what you were used to looking at? Anything with the website you noticed that you want to mention? Nothing?
Okay. Very good. Thanks.
All right, we are going to move into our 6 elements with our Kentucky framework. And so those of you that are familiar with MTSS and the structure and the framework from a national perspective know that we really have our research supports 4 initial elements, and in Kentucky we have added to that. We have expanded those just a little bit. So we're going to go through those elements this morning. We're going to make sure that you understand all 6 of those elements and what is encompassed within each one. And then we'll spend a little bit of time with each one of the elements and what that looks like in practice. What does it look like in a district? What does it look like in a school? How do we implement that? So our first element we're going to be looking at is equitable access and opportunity. And if you remember, Jan mentioned that equitable access and opportunity was our circle around the graphic. So really, with all of the equitable access and opportunity, we want to make sure that we are providing equity and access to all students. And so when I say all students, we definitely mean all students. We're going to talk about that just a little bit in a minute. I think you all have already seen this, but these were just some of the pieces that we wanted to highlight from the website. The resources and tools section is at the bottom of each one of those, and then that's what that drop-down menu at the bottom of that looks like. We really have already gone over that, so. All right, so I want you to take just a second and look at this definition, about 30 seconds, and process this and what this means to you in your position, in your district, or in your building. About 30 seconds. Just read that to yourself. So as you notice, every student, every is the very first word, access to educational resources and rigor, and we're going to talk about what resources are. Resources are not just curriculum. There's a lot more things that are involved with resources when we mention that word resources. Resources and rigor they need at the right moment in their education across race, gender, ethnicity, language, disability, sexual orientation, family background, and or family income. So what does this mean to you in your position right now? Somebody tell me, what does that mean?
All means all.
All means all, absolutely. What else?
IEP is not curriculum and rigor.
IEP is not a curriculum or rigor, absolutely. At the right moment. What do we think of when we see that phrase, at the right moment? Do all kids need the same thing at the same time? Absolutely not. They're all going to get to different places. They're going to need different supports. They're going to need different services at different times. A student may need a support for 6 to 8 weeks, and then they may not need that support any longer. It doesn't mean once a student is in some type of intervention that they stay in that intervention for 2 to 3 years without appropriate progress monitoring to know what we need to do with that student. Do we need to move them into a more intensive tier? Do we need to move them into a less intensive tier? So that at the right moment is really important to me, and I want you all to remember that as we go throughout the day. Everybody's going to need something different at different times. And then obviously, to us here in this region and in your districts, which one of those sticks out to you the most that you see at the bottom? Which one of those? or family income. So let's talk a little bit about that. What does that mean to us?
Job loss.
Could be a job loss in a family. Right, we used to think of, a lot of our kids were having a hard time, or they may not have had the best family environment. But right now, in the midst of coming out on the other side of a pandemic, it's not some of our kids or most of our kids, it's absolutely all of our kids. And when we think about all of our kids, it's also all of the adults in our buildings that are servicing all of our kids. So we really need to think about, are we providing equitable access and opportunity with everything we're doing within the building, which includes math, reading, writing. It includes our social emotional learning. It includes our behavior supports. It includes positive adults on a daily basis. So really that encompasses everything that we are doing. We want to make sure that that is embedded and encompassed into everything all the other elements that are part of that MTSS framework. Notice this says at the state, regional, district, school, and student level. So we're going to be looking at this today from a district perspective, from a building level perspective, from an individual student perspective. So we're going to look at all 4 levels of teaming, and we're going to look at all 4 levels of support, and really what does that look like? What should it look like? What are the things that we're doing really well, and what are the things that maybe we need to improve upon? So equitable access and opportunity. When we think about that, it includes our leadership teams. So when we talk about teaming at the district level, at the building level, at the individual student level, are we including representatives that serve those students from that community? Notice that that's in there. Through monthly meetings and data leadership teams. So we're going to talk a little bit about the data. What data do we need to look at to make sure that we are providing equitable access and opportunity? We are used to looking at state testing data. We're used to looking at universal screening data. But do we always dig deep enough into the data to know if that data is equitable in providing services and supports to our students? We have something new in Kentucky called the Equity Dashboard. We're going to talk to you a little bit about that today and about what that looks like, but really it's just going to take another layer off of that data and dig a little bit deeper. Now, remember earlier I said something about resources. Resources are not just the curriculum. So this says funding of resources, which includes, I want you to think about all of these things: people, materials, and time. What does that mean to you if you're at the building level right now or at the district level? People, materials, and time. Take just a second and think about that. What does that mean to you? We often think about materials. That's the first thing that we think about when we think about resources. But what about people? Are our people, our teachers, our instructional assistants, our interventionists, whoever we have in our districts, in our buildings, are they equitable in how we have them supporting our schools? Are they equitable at the school level in how we have them supporting different grade levels or different students based upon the need that our data shows? And then time. What does that mean to you all when we think about time being a part of that equitable access and opportunity? What comes to mind first? Y'all are being way too quiet this morning.
There's never enough time.
Well, there's never enough time. But when we think about time, do we know what amount of time everyone is getting or receiving a service or support? Is kind of where I go with that when we start thinking about that. So if we're looking at core instruction for reading, what is our non-negotiable as a district? What's our non-negotiable as a building? Are we providing 90 minutes? Are we providing 120 minutes? And do we know and can we ensure that every student sitting in the seats in our district or our building is getting that 120 minutes on a daily basis? So what's our method or mode for monitoring that? How do we know that that's occurring? So when we think about time and distributing that time equally and evenly, we need to make sure that it's always based upon the data. Now, I think Jacob's moving my slides around on me here.
Well, I'm trying to keep that chat window off.
Oh, okay. And then thinking about our professional development. So I think with COVID, it's kind of changed a lot of the way that we provide professional learning, that we do professional learning. Right now, today, we have more people virtually than we do in person. So we know that professional learning looks differently now than maybe it did 3 or 4 years ago. But when we think about that professional development, professional learning, are we providing what our district needs? Are we providing what the data says that we are deficient in? Sometimes we think that we know what professional learning or professional development we need, so we go ahead and we schedule that or we plan that. But I want you to be thinking about today as we go throughout the morning, am I really providing professional development that's appropriate for my district, for my teachers, for whoever it is, based upon the needs that we have in our district? And we know what our needs are based upon our what? Data, based upon our data.
We had somebody in virtually, you were asking people to share out, that posted that something else that you have to think about is they say programs. Every salesman knows we have money, so we must ensure that they're effective.
Absolutely. How many of y'all in the room today have bought a new program in the past 18 months? I bet every hand in here should be up. So when we think about that, you're right. Every salesman wants to sell you their latest, greatest program. It's the flashiest, it's the newest, it's the neatest, it does this, it does this, it does this. But we really need to dig into what does the research say this program supports. Does it support our students, and how is it designed, and all of those things. So we'll talk about that as well when we get into evidence-based instruction. So when we think about that data analyzation piece that goes around equitable access and opportunity, we really need to be thinking about some different things. So I want you to begin thinking about data this morning. The first thing that it says is that equity dashboard within the statewide reporting system. So that is something that is coming very soon. How many of you all have heard about this or seen this? Awesome, awesome. A couple of you, that's great. Jan may want to talk about that in just a second, but that is part of our Infinite Campus. It's part of our statewide reporting system. Everyone is going to have access to that. Another thing that we want to be looking at is when we think about behavior, behavioral health, social emotional learning, our office discipline referrals. We know, and the research supports, our kids who have externalizing behaviors, they're going to be our high flyers. They're going to have our highest numbers of office discipline referrals. But we know our kids that have internalizing behaviors are probably not going to flag on this list. So where's the data that we're using to equitably look at those students? We want to make sure that that's equitable as well. We want to be looking at out of instructional time. You know that out of instructional time in the Infinite Campus reporting system is supposed to be from the time a student leaves your classroom until they come back into your classroom. So do we have a way of monitoring and ensuring that that data is correct, number one, and number two, that we're looking at it and making sure that it's equitable for all students? Looking at our universal screening or course failures, early warning tool. How many of you all are currently using the early warning tool in your building? Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit when we get into data. And then are we looking at advanced, dual credit, career and technical enrollment? So Jan's going to share with you a little bit about that equity dashboard, and I think when to expect that and what you'll be seeing out of that.
Yes, it's currently in development. It will be part of the Tableau on Infinite Campus. If you've used that before at all, there will be, you will be able to designate who actually can look at it. It's a school administrator or district level administrator access really only because of the confidentiality of information. It's going to look at over and under representation. So there's a tab where you can look at by race and ethnicity, by migrant status, EL status, special education, socioeconomic status. So it lists a lot of different demographic factors that can impact learning. For underrepresentation, we look at are any of these subpopulations underrepresented in advanced coursework, in gifted and talented programs, in CTE pathways, in CTE completers. So there's a dashboard that will give you at risk of over or under representation. We look at underrepresentation for proficiency in reading, writing, math, science, and social studies. I'm saying all those, but it's the areas that we test through statewide testing. And we also look at, do we have, because it's overrepresented in terms of identification for special education, disciplinary actions, chronic attendance issues. So as you're digging down into the data, you can use that dashboard to kind of, again, fine-tune your action plan to say, we may look okay from a global perspective in this area, but when I dig down, it identifies subgroups who are not doing quite so well, and it will help you with your action planning. The goal right now is to release that. I think the target date is the end of this month. It's still based on making sure it's pulling the right data from IC. It's pulling data live, so it's always based on your population. There'll be a guidance document with it to show you how to interpret it, and some videos that will also help you with interpreting. So again, it's a really good tool for your district MTSS team, your school level MTSS team to dig down into the data.
My favorite part of that is the foster student population. I know that you all in your districts that are here today have large numbers of students who are in care, and that's one of the populations in Kentucky that is near and dear to my heart. So I really am very thankful that we are looking at those kiddos and looking at what they are receiving or possibly what they're missing. We know how transient they are, and we know how oftentimes they can slip through cracks. So. Moving on with equitable access and opportunity, we want to think about our policies, programs, and practices. So when we think about policies, we have academic policies, but most often we think about, with equitable access and opportunity, our disciplinary policies. So what is in our district code of conduct? What is in our handbook, our behavior handbook? What do we have in place in writing to make sure that all of these pieces with discipline are equitable? So it's talking about examining for underlying assumptions, limiting beliefs based, again, on ability, gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, disability, and EL proficiency. So we want to make sure that our policies are not targeting or are not looking at, we want to make sure that we are looking at biases in those areas. We also want to look at instructional resources, that they reflect all student cultures. So we think about all the different cultures that come together in one building or in one school district. We want to make sure that any curriculum we're using, any instructional strategies we are using, any interventions we are using are appropriate for that student's culture. One of the things that I recall was working with first graders, and it was talking about where someone lived. It was in a story. We were practicing comprehension, and they lived in a brownstone. Well, I don't know about you all, but I've never lived in a brownstone. Has anybody in here ever lived in a brownstone? So that's something that we oftentimes think of in a larger urban area, so making sure that our language and all of our resources is appropriate for our kids and where they live, and that they understand those things. And then when we get into intervention, instruction and intervention in all three tiers of prevention are responsive to those diverse needs. So making sure that whatever we are providing students is responsive to what we are hearing are the needs. So if you will go back to, it's going to be the second portion of your guided notes. What's our time here?
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Let's do 5 to 10. We're a little bit behind, so let's do 5 to 10 minutes. Let's maybe shoot for 7 or 8. I want you all to spend about 7 or 8 minutes, and I want you to be thinking about what were the things with equitable access and opportunity in this element that you thought we're doing a really good job with those things? What were the things that you thought that's a good point, maybe we need to work on that? Or any questions that you may have, okay? So about 7 minutes, go to your guided notes. We will come around to different districts and answer any questions that you may have in that time as well, okay?
Are you ready? I've got you muted still.
Okay.
Ready?
Yeah.
Go for it.
Okay, I think our breakout rooms are closing. Is everyone back from breakout rooms? Yes, I'm seeing a thumbs up. Yes, over here too. Okay, so what were some of the pieces that you all discussed, either from a building perspective or a district perspective, that are things that you may be thinking about, things you may want to work on, or things that you thought, we're doing that really well, we're doing a really good job with such and such, with equitable access and opportunity. So what were some of those? Floyd County, thank you for sharing.
We got our team together. Yeah, we're excited. We're a large team today, so we're excited to have our entire district team here and a lot of our counselors. We focused on our new SEL curriculum and how, and we let our principals share as far as, first of all, equitable access and how that looks in their school. That every student is getting the opportunity to utilize the resources that come along with our SEL curriculum.
Remind me, are you using Stanford Harmony?
Great, 7 mindsets.
Okay, thank you, sorry.
So, and that's a new undertaking for us this year. So we want to make sure as a district and as a district team that all of our students have equitable access to that, and that they are getting the opportunity to benefit from the resources. And we were in the process of sharing what it looks like in each of our schools and some takeaways when our time was up.
Okay, so I'm going to question you a little bit on that. So I'm assuming what you mean by that, by we want to make sure that everybody has access to that equitable access, is looking maybe at scheduling.
Scheduling, yeah.
So
there's some issues at the high school level where we have kids that are going to, we got kids in virtual academy, we got kids that go to the School of Innovation, and there's different schedules. So it's more of an issue at the high school level than it is at our middle elementary.
And when we think about elementary, one of the issues that we think about with scheduling with elementary with something like a social emotional learning program or curriculum is we can give it to teachers, we can request that they're teaching one lesson a week, for example, or 10 minutes a day, or whatever that looks like, whatever your non-negotiables are, but how do we monitor and ensure that that's occurring? So it's kind of like a double-sided coin there, for sure. Absolutely. Thank you all for sharing. We'll go to McGoffin. Anything that came up with you all, with your team?
I think we're doing wonderful with meeting the needs of students, the virtual students, and ones that when we were all virtual, with providing internet access to all
Okay.
students. And we had a tremendous amount of students that didn't have internet, and our district is willing to provide that to those who don't have it. And our Chromebooks, of course, they've checked those out. Just in contact, we have spent tons of time contacting parents that you never see at middle school, especially, even when normal times you don't see. So I've spent myself, I don't know what the hours, on the phone, youth service center, going out doing visits, trying to find these kids that haven't done virtual or aren't in person.
So I'm going to hone in on one thing that you mentioned, talking about the internet access. So one of the things that was very apparent from 5 days into COVID was the inequity with our internet access, and it wasn't just kids who couldn't afford internet access, right? It's because of locations. And so I think that's a really good example. It's a prime example of it's not always about socioeconomic status as to what the barrier was there. So thank you for sharing that. Anything from the district perspective you all would like to share?
One thing we discussed was similar to Floyd in the scheduling and with ensuring with virtual academies that you are not forgetting those students. And it sounds like that Bonnie spoke from the middle school there, that they're having some success with that. But I think we talked more about high school. I'm at the district level, but have high school background, high school principal here.
Sure.
And as those students get older, naturally those contacts tend to get looser, and we have to be intentional and not lose focus on that, especially when they're not showing up every day, so that we don't forget about them.
Absolutely, that's a great point. Thank you. Dace, anything big that came out of your all's discussion that you want to share?
We listened in with them too.
Okay.
Talking about the ACL.
Okay. What about Knott County? Anything that came out of your all's discussion?
One of the things we discussed is, we don't know what we don't know. So our first step is we have to build a system so we know which students do not have equitable access. Well, we think we know, but do we really actually know which ones do not? So I think that's the first step.
So when you think about that system, did you think about data first, or did you think about something else first?
Well, we probably thought about something else first, because we've got data. And we've had that for a while, so we've got to really almost do it on a student basis. When we're looking at it, we were a team of 2 in our group, but I think, we're a smaller school, so we can do that.
Okay, thank you. Cordia, anything big that came out of your all's discussion with equitable access and opportunity?
We really think that we have a good schedule in place, using the time that we have, using the people that we have. We're learning a lot more about our resources that are available to us, which will help. And we really wanted to start focusing more on the social emotional part of our students. That's, like you say, coming out of COVID and the pandemic and stuff, and we really need to focus on that a lot more than we have.
Okay. And I'm assuming, kind of like Floyd shared, like everybody has access to that support. Okay. What about our virtual teams? Did any of the virtual teams have anything they wanted to share out? They might.
Knott County just said that they understand and are aware of their needs and their areas of weakness, and they have a willingness to learn. And then that in fact their weaknesses or their needs are more time and then human resources.
Okay. Sometimes we are very resource rich and implementation poor, so I think we have to be mindful of that. So.
Oh, hold on, we're going to ask.
Anybody else over there? Letcher, have anything?
They're asking.
Okay. What about Breathitt County? Anything they want to share?
Well, I have a donut in my mouth.
Sorry.
Data literacy and
So-
fidelity to the process.
Okay, so when we talk about data literacy, that's a great point. Thank you, Breathitt. We think about data literacy from the top down, but sometimes who do we forget? Who sometimes gets forgotten with data literacy? Who do y'all think? What about classroom teachers? Sometimes we'll do a really good job at the district level or even at the school administrator level, but then our classroom teachers really struggle with that data literacy if we haven't provided them the appropriate professional learning. And it can also be the opposite. It can be that our teachers are really great at that data literacy and digging into it and figuring out what's going on where, but that maybe someone from the top isn't always looking and monitoring. So when we think about that data literacy, that's a great point, but it has to be everyone. Everyone has to be data literate. Thank you. Anybody else? Before we move on, anybody else?
I wanted to tag on something about the data literacy piece.
Sure.
It kind of made me think about kind of what Knott County was kind of talking about. It's like, I think when we get to the database decision-making section, some of this will kind of begin to kind of make some more sense. But I think one of the things that you said is we have a feeling that we know kind of what an issue may be. And I think that's a great starting place, because a lot of times we have our finger on the pulse and we think this is an issue. So it's very good to start that as a broad-based concern. That's where the digging into the data piece sometimes is so critical as a next step in your database decision making, because then you can kind of go, we think this is an issue in our district. What data might we need to be able to see if it is, or maybe what data might show us what subpopulation this affects. And then that can start you in on your problem solving process of digging into maybe the why and coming up with some solutions. Excuse me. And I wanted to say too, one of the counties on virtual had commented, they had identified a population of foster students who they really struggle because it's such transient population. And so then you think about what barriers might you have that you have no control over. So then at the school or district level, you've identified a subpopulation, then think about what things you might be able to put in place in the school or the district to support those students for the time that they're there.
That's a great point. Thank you. Okay, we're getting ready to move into the tiered delivery system. So y'all are getting ready to hear me get really excited. So the tiered delivery system is the heart of all MTSS structures and frameworks. So if you take nothing else from today, I really want you to dig into this section and this element. So when we think about that tiered delivery system, it's in the center of our graphic for a reason. Everything flows through it, everything flows around it, and we really, really have to make sure that we have an appropriate tiered prevention system. So when we think about prevention, we are preventing failure. That's what MTSS is all about, is preventing failure. There was a time when, and you don't have to raise your hands, but I would say a lot of us in this room, and I will say me included, thought MTSS, academic RTI, was a pathway to special education. We know that it is not a pathway to special education. So when we think about that, I think academic RTI 20 years ago, that's what we thought of when we thought of that. But we know that now it's all about prevention and about meeting benchmarks. So digging into a tiered continuum of supports. It's a preventative framework. If you remember nothing else, it's that it prevents. We're preventing student failure. Academically, socially, behaviorally, we are preventing students from failing. That's the purpose of all MTSS frameworks. We're going to provide instruction, intervention, and supports in all three tiers of delivery to maximize student achievement, prevent failure, and close any gaps that we may have. It is a continuous improvement cycle. Once we have an MTSS structure or framework, we don't just stop and drop and leave it. We continually look at our data, we continually improve, and we are always looking at what we can add, what we need to change based upon our data. It is also a continuum of layered support. So we're going to talk a little bit about those layered supports and what that looks like in a district or in a building, but it allows schools to identify areas of strength and areas of deficit based upon the data, and then be able to respond to student needs in a flexible way. So that flexible way is talking about once we have a structure, it's not always going to be that structure for years and years. We're going to change it based upon needs. So how many of you all have seen this triangle? Does this look familiar to anyone? All right. So we've all seen the triangle, and we all think we know what the triangle is, but let's really dig in and talk a little bit about it. So with MTSS, we have 3 tiers of prevention: Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. They're also called primary prevention, secondary prevention, tertiary prevention. We know that in Tier 1, there is an approximately equivalent to 80%. Now, what that tells us is that 80% is our goal. It does not tell us that we have to put 80% of our student population in Tier 1. 100% of our student population receives Tier 1 services and supports on a daily basis, ongoing all the time. What it tells us is that research supports with our core instruction in Tier 1, about 80% of student population should meet benchmark. The research also tells us and supports that there are going to be a group of students who are going to need something in addition to Tier 1. They're going to need something in addition to core instruction. So, based upon research, about 15% of our population, again, it's a goal for us. Remember, that's a goal, would be receiving a Tier 2 intervention, evidence-based intervention, or a Tier 2 support, and 5% or less would be receiving some type of intensive Tier 3 support. Now, in Kentucky, we almost have a Tier 4. We don't have a graphic that has Tier 4, but our Tier 4 students, or students that have progressed all the way through the prevention layers, are then, if data determines that those supports were not enough for those students to meet benchmark, then those students would be identified and we would create an individualized education plan for them, okay? So I want you to remember that. So students who have gone all the way through the tiers, and we determined that even Tier 3 intensive intervention, one-on-one individual intervention and supports were not enough to help them meet benchmark, that's when we do a referral, we go through the process, we have the admissions release committee meeting, and we determine if they meet criteria for an individualized education plan in Kentucky, okay? All right, what are some of the questions that you all sometimes hear around this triangle? Any questions that you hear? Any misconceptions that you hear around the triangle? Anybody ever hear we can only take the bottom 5% of our population and put them in Tier 3 interventions and supports? That's a very, very common misconception, that we have to look at our data, we have to look at assessment, and we have to say, well, look, here's the bottom 5% of our students, let's put them in a Tier 3 intervention. That's technically not how it should work, right? So the research supports that's our goal, but if we have 11% of our students who criteria says they do not meet benchmark and they qualify for a Tier 3 service or support, then we provide that to that percentage. So whatever our data supports. Okay? Now, we talked a little bit about layering. So I want you to begin thinking about layering of the triangle when you start thinking about your interventions as far as core instruction Tier 1, interventions in Tier 2, and interventions in Tier 3. So students, all students should receive core Tier 1 instruction. We're all clear on that. We all know that. But when we think about students who need a Tier 2 intervention or support, we're going to layer that on top of Tier 1. It doesn't mean that they don't get Tier 1 and they only get Tier 2. It means they get it in addition to. In the guidance document on the website, you will see that phrase, in addition to, in addition to. That means they receive all core instruction and then they receive an extra evidence-based intervention. The same with Tier 3, okay? So we want to think of those supports as layered. They do not stand in isolation and they do not stand alone. Any questions about that? Thoughts? Do you think that your classroom teachers in your district or in your building understand that these supports are layered? Do we think that they know that, they understand that that's something that they would say if we were in your building today and ask? What are your all's thoughts?
I think the model on the triangle, the multi-tier prevention model, has been around through PBIS and through many other program systems, back to Maslow even. But I think it's connecting everyone with a systemic process, with forms and planning, so that we're not overwhelmed and that it can be done feasibly in order. I think we're getting more knowledgeable with training and we're doing a better job, even a great job. I just think with more training we'll be able to put it all together and like you said, join to one team instead of 3 different teams.
Right.
And then have forms that will actually match what we're doing, hopefully universal district-wide for that equitable access.
Absolutely. And I will tell you who I think struggles with this the most is our brand new teachers and our teachers who have gone through some type of alternative certification process. And we know that right now we have a large number of those teachers in our districts across the state. There is a large number. So even though we think that we oftentimes everybody understands, it's connecting it, just like you said. It's having a review of those things. It's just having that discussion, whether it's in PLCs, whether it's in a faculty meeting, whatever it is, it's having that ongoing discussion that we don't just talk about it once and then 2 years later we go, well, I thought you knew that. It's making sure that that is a continual process, whether it's with your professional learning or whether it's part of a process like you're mentioning where we're looking at from a school level, from a district level down to the individual student level. So the layering of supports is super important when we start talking about MTSS. So this is another graphic. We always talk about MTSS as an umbrella term. So when we think about MTSS, I want you to actually think about in your head that big umbrella that encompasses the whole triangle. So multi-tiered systems of support initially meant that we took multiple systems. So we took a PBIS system, we took an academic RTI system, and we integrated those systems. We are to the point now, and all the research supports, that that word systems no longer has an S on it. So we don't want to be thinking about 3 different systems. We want to think about one system. And we want to take students through that system and provide services and supports to whatever their area of deficit is, instead of thinking about combining multiple systems. So when you think about it like this, we still have our 3 layers, our 3 prevention levels of Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, but we're always going to think about what's included on the academic side. And a lot of you in your districts probably still call this academic RTI. So what are we doing for academic RTI? Do we have appropriate supports in place? What does core instruction look like? What does Tier 2 evidence-based interventions, what do those look like? How do students qualify? And then if those are not enough, what do we provide them for Tier 3 supports? So we take students through that. We are continually looking at data and progress monitoring those students for improvements. Then when we move to the other side, we think about PBIS. So when we think about PBIS, that's our positive behavior supports. So what do we have in place at Tier 1? What do we have core instruction-wise for behavior? Are we teaching those things? Oftentimes, for behavior, we hear 3 things. When students are misbehaving, we hear 3 words. Does anybody know what they are? No, stop, and don't. Those are the 3 words that we love to use with kids who are not following behavior expectations. But when we think about positive behavior, we're teaching students at core Tier 1 in all classrooms across the building, what are the expectations for you on a daily basis? These are the things that we need you to do. These are the things that we expect you to do. So that's what positive behavioral supports look like really at core Tier 1. And then when we think about that integrated system, we're looking at things like social emotional learning. Social emotional learning is a part of an integrated school mental health framework. So when we think about SEL, it fits into our school mental health framework. We also are looking at things like trauma, which when we talk about our foster kids, that's one of those pieces of data we'll be looking at. When we talk about our Handle with Care initiative, that's another piece of trauma data. So we're making sure that all of the different pieces of data that we should be looking at fit somewhere into this prevention model, okay? When we move into Tier 2 and Tier 3 on the PBIS, behavioral health side, you may just say behavior, whatever you call it in your district. When you move into Tier 2 and Tier 3, we really have to be looking at data to determine which students need an evidence-based intervention. Now, once upon a time I was a school counselor, and do you know how I knew that kids in my building needed behavior intervention? How did I know that?
They were sent to you.
Office referrals.
Well, it wasn't office referrals at that time, it was a long time ago.
They dropped them off.
They called and they said, Jatavius has thrown a chair across the classroom for the 2nd time today, come get him now. That was how we knew a kiddo needed some type of intervention, right? So when we think about it, we didn't have data to support that always. But we are to the point that we have to make sure that we're not just placing students in an intervention for Tier 2 or Tier 3 because we think it's something they need. We have to have the data to support this is what they need and this is why. This is the behavior they are presenting, and this is what the area of deficit is in order to match an evidence-based intervention to that area of deficit, okay? So we need to be thinking about that. What is our data we're looking at in Tier 1 to move students into a Tier 2 support or into a Tier 3 support? It can't just be, they're driving me crazy, I need you to come get them. Can you please do something with them? Because we've all been there. We've all heard it at some point, right? So that really is an overview. Remember, it has that big MTSS umbrella on top of it, and it is one system. It's not multiple systems. It's not one system with two sides. It's one system that everything is integrated into. So when we dig in a little bit deeper into Tier 1, universal foundational layer, all students receive high quality evidence-based core instruction. Again, you have to be thinking about how are we monitoring that? How do I know that? If I'm the administrator, if I'm someone from the district level, how am I ensuring that that's occurring in every classroom? And then align to grade level state standards. It's Jacob's fault again. In that integrated system with behavioral expectations and social emotional competencies. So when we think about those things, when we're teaching math, we're also teaching social emotional learning. When we're teaching reading, we're also teaching social skills. We're teaching how to get along with peers. And so SEL and those social emotional learning competencies don't stand alone. They're integrated into our day. We talk about them continually. It's not just a 20-minute time that we have once a week. We may give a lesson once a week, but it is continual. We are giving that lesson and then we are reinforcing it with positive affirmations as we go throughout the week in different across contents, whether it's science, social studies, reading, whatever. So core Tier 1 universal supports. Then we move into Tier 2. Again, it's supplemental. It is targeted. Typically in Tier 2, we're going to be providing intervention in some type of small group setting. I'm going to say this. Small group is not an evidence-based intervention. It's the setting we provide the intervention in, okay? But we hear that all the time. So we want to make sure that some students are provided evidence-based intervention in addition to what they're receiving in Tier 1. Now, how do we know and how do we ensure that what they're receiving in that Tier 2 intervention is appropriate? We're looking at the data, and we are providing professional learning to our classroom teachers or whoever's providing that intervention to make sure that they understand how that evidence-based intervention is delivered with fidelity, okay? These are students who are oftentimes at risk. They could, in Kentucky, also be students who are exceeding benchmark. Kentucky is one of the very few states across the country that has written into policy that we will provide interventions for gifted and talented students. Now, there's a little misconception there. You cannot qualify for a gifted student service plan by going through any type of RTI. But if you are identified, then we should be providing supports at Tier 2, okay? And then target skills deficits, typically small group setting. But notice this doesn't say based on a standard. Let's talk about that for just a second. Based on skills. What does that mean to you?
Individualized.
It's individualized, it's based on skills deficits, it's based on some type of data. When we talk about reteaching is part of differentiation in core Tier 1 instruction, okay? So those are two different things that we oftentimes hear about Tier 2. That we just want to go ahead and clear up this morning.
Megan, can I also just kind of say something here too? I think too when we talk about Tier 2, I always think about it, it's in addition to Tier 1, it is aligned to the instruction that we're giving, you know, that's aligned to our standards or aligned to our behavior expectations, that are aligned to the social emotional competencies that we've identified in our local context. However, and when we talk about the layered support, it's also layered in intensity and focus. And so the focus then becomes more targeted, and that's why sometimes it's not just a reteaching of a standard and we go back to that skill. We have intensified the focus. So that was a kind of a clarifying thing for me, which may help for you as well.
Yes.
So, we're school counselors, and Floyd County has a school counselor, thank God, in every school. Would check in and check out, if all school counselors are trained on it, it's evidence-based, serve for tier 2 or tier 3 or both?
It could be both, and we'll talk about that. Yes, but yes, it could be both. So when we think about an intervention like that as absolutely evidence-based, it depends on how you're utilizing it, and you can actually utilize it in tier 2 and tier 3 if we're increasing intensity and frequency.
I just think that we get so many options that we need to do one well, rather than so many different ones coming in.
So that goes back again to our professional learning. So if you've provided professional learning to all people, not just counselors that could be providing that, then again it goes back to, are we implementing, and are we implementing with fidelity? That's a great question. Thank you. Anybody have any other questions about tier 2 before we jump into tier 3?
What is the recommendation on changing interventions in tier 2?
So
we seem to have staff that get stuck on the same intervention and the kid's not making progress, so instead of switching up the intervention, the teams want to move them on to tier 3.
Okay, so that's a great question. Her question again, just to summarize, was what's the recommendation on, what is that? Okay. What's the recommendation on changing interventions instead of moving and increasing tiers, correct? So I think that it all goes back to best practice. So best practice says that we are looking at an evidence-based intervention and the progress monitoring data for 6 to 8 weeks before we make any type of decision. And when we make that decision, the discussion has to be, what progress is the student making? So the student is making minimal progress, the student is making no progress, the student is making adequate progress. So when we think about those things, it is up to your district if you would like to put criteria in place, because it's not in legislation anywhere, it's not in a recommendation, but it's up to your district as to what the guidelines are. But I think we always want to look at, could we change the intervention, or could we change who's providing the intervention if it's not being provided with fidelity, before moving into an additional tier of support.
One other question you could ask as a team is, not only was it implemented as intended, which is good, because sometimes there's just some barriers and we find out that there were some issues, but the other thing is, was it matched? Did we match the intervention to the skill deficit that was identified? And so sometimes there's not a good intervention match, and so you might just change the intervention in tier 2 to do a better match and collect some data a little bit longer. But if you can answer that it's done with fidelity, that it matched the skill deficit, and you have your data that shows the response to intervention is not at a level that the student is making progress, then that's your decision-making rule.
And I also would go back to, what does the data that we have on this individual student show? So just because we have criteria and guidelines, if a student is 3 to 4 grade levels behind, where same age, same grade peers are, then we may look at what is the intervention, was it an appropriate intervention? Because maybe we need to change that as well. Like, I think that's part of that process, and that occurs during those team meetings.
Well, and it's all about the evidence-based practice. And like we alluded to earlier, the number of teachers we have that are getting into education in a non-traditional format.
Yes, yes.
This discussion just really highlights how all these elements are interconnected. I mean, it really does.
Okay, any other questions before we jump into tier 3? And then I promise I'll give y'all a break. Okay, so tier 3, when we think about the most intense layer of support, students should have already received some type of tier 2 evidence-based intervention for a period of a minimum of 6 to 8 weeks, and the progress monitoring data should support that that was not adequate. They were not making adequate progress, okay? Few students are provided a tier 3 support. It's always based on that data. And like I mentioned earlier with that check-in, check-out, we can absolutely provide the same intervention for a tier 2 and a tier 3, but it needs to be an increase in intensity and frequency. So for example, for check-in, check-out, what we would be looking at is typical check-in and check-out. How we start with a student is a morning and afternoon check-in. If we wanted to use check-in and check-out and move that student to tier 3 intervention supports, we would need to add an additional check-in. So it might be a lunch check-in. So that's one example of how you can increase that. If we're looking at something like for a first grade, kindergarten, first grade, second grade LLI, level literacy intervention, or something of that nature, then we're providing, let's say at tier 2, 20 minutes 3 times a week. We would need to increase that time and frequency. So instead of 3 times a week, we may go to 5 times a week. We may increase the number of minutes, okay?
Also, on the check-in, check-out, for it to be done with fidelity, they meet with every child's teacher, if they have multiple teachers, or with one teacher, and that has to be tracked. So if it's not tracked, even though they're checking in, checking out with the person that's assigned to them, whether it's a school counselor or someone else on the school level, then it's still not implemented with fidelity.
Right.
So that may be a case that you would drop back and change who's on the team. You know,
Who's providing the
everybody has
intervention.
to be invested and be part of that check in, check out, or you can never measure the document. The data wouldn't be valid or reliable.
Well, you wouldn't have data, I'm assuming, if they're not, right?
Right.
Yes.
So what I'm saying is, even though you have someone checking in, checking out, it's the in-betweens that matter too.
Right. That's part of that intervention.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, moving down into evidence-based interventions, typically delivered in a very small group setting or individual. So most often with Tier 3, we see no more than 3 students in a group, and oftentimes is individualized, okay? So moving into Tier 3, we're going to go into systems, data, and practices. Johnny, is it okay if we go through this before we take a break? I know we're running a little bit behind. Is that okay? Okay. All right, so when we think about systems for your multi-tiered prevention system, do we have a school-wide system for screening and assessment? So it doesn't mean that I have 4 first grade teachers and they all 4 do these things differently. School-wide system means that we have some consistency, that we have a way we're tracking and looking at data, okay? Analytical data, we're looking critically, we're determining criteria for students. So what is our benchmark? Depending upon what universal screener you utilize, every one of those has a different benchmark. Those evidence-based screeners are nationally normed. They have benchmarks, some of them have multiple benchmarks, they have cut scores. So we have to make sure that we're looking at what that assessment says is benchmark. Is one thing that we oftentimes see that we struggle with. Again, when we're looking at benchmark, is everybody within the same school, everybody within the same district? Are we looking at the same benchmarks? Do we have those established? Is that something we need to talk about, okay? Also, you'll be talking about benchmarks for behavior. So it's not just our academic screeners, but if we're providing some type of behavioral health screener, what is the benchmark for that? What is the score that indicates a student needs some type of service or support for SEL or mental health or whatever that may look like? Professional learning opportunities, we've already really talked about that, making sure that they are not only equitable and they're appropriate for equity and access, but they also are appropriate, just like she was mentioning, have we trained these evidence-based interventions? We're not just telling a teacher, go provide this, and they don't know how to provide it, making sure that we provide those opportunities. Tier 1 professional learning focuses on differentiation. We talked about that a little bit. That focuses on that reteach, that focuses on some of those pieces where we may not have mastered a standard. And then problem-solving processes in place for each tier of instruction and intervention, and we'll dig into the problem-solving process in just a little bit. We'll really talk about what that 4-step problem-solving process looks like in each of those layers and levels, okay? When looking at data, we want to make sure that we're looking at all the data at the same time together. So notice this says academic, behavior, social, emotional. You may also have some type of mental health data that you're looking at. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. Universal, Tier 1, we're looking at that from a district perspective, from a school perspective, from a grade level or content level, PLC, and then individual student level. And making sure that we have a process in place to look at data at all 4 of those different levels is key. Student outcome data as well as intervention tracking data. When we get into the data element and we start talking about that, we're going to look at, we know we need to track progress monitoring for individual students, but we also need to track whole numbers of students. So if I'm a building administrator, do I know how many second graders are in a Tier 2 and Tier 3 reading intervention? And of those 22 second graders that are in that intervention, what percentage of those students are making progress? Because if I have 22 students in an intervention and I have 3 of them making progress, there's something wrong with my intervention. So we really need to be looking at those pieces from several different perspectives. And then again, data should be utilized in that continuous improvement process, determining priorities as we go. When we look at our practices under tiered prevention systems, equitable, responsive, evidence-based, we're going to talk about evidence-based all day, we're going to talk about preventative all day. So those are two things that are super important when we start thinking about what supports we are putting in place or we need to put in place in our district or building. Is it matched to the area of deficit? So oftentimes I think reading is a great example. Oftentimes we have students who don't meet benchmark on a reading assessment, a universal screener of some sort, and we put them in some type of fluency intervention. Well, if fluency isn't their area of deficit and comprehension is, then that is not going to do us any good. So we're wasting time, effort, and energy. We're wasting those resources providing an intervention that does not match the area of deficit. All tiers of instruction and intervention are delivered in an environment where students feel safe, supported, and welcome. So that is key when we start thinking about that psychological safety of students. So we know that we have lots of pieces in place for physical safety in our buildings, but what does the psychological safety of our kiddos look like? It's more important now than ever. Coming out of COVID with some of our kids reporting huge increases in anxiety. We also know that in Kentucky we have an increase in suicide attempts among our youth right now. So all of those things are super important when we start talking about psychological safety. Okay, so that was a lot of information, a lot of pieces and parts to that one element of our multi-tiered prevention systems, okay? So what we are going to do now is in your teams, if you are virtual, you have this activity on a PowerPoint slide that you can type into. It's a triangle that looks just like what you're seeing on your screen. Those of you that are in person, we have chart paper and markers on the tables, but you are just going to create your triangle. You are then going to put into your triangle what are the pieces that you are struggling with, okay? So we're going to talk about what are the things that we really know that we need to work on. We're going to at the end of the day be working on an action plan for you to take away this afternoon. So I want you to think about, start with tier 1. What are the things we're doing really well? Celebrate that for just a second and then say, here's the thing that we're struggling with, okay? It may be like somebody mentioned earlier, scheduling. We really want to make sure scheduling is equitable for SEL as opposed to reading, or it may be that our reading schedule is not equitable. At the secondary, it may be something with intervention scheduling, whatever that looks like for you all. So as a district team or a building team, however you are, if you are 2 buildings together, just have that discussion and put it on one triangle. We're going to spend about 10 minutes doing this activity. If you have questions, we are more than happy to answer those questions, but just go ahead and create that triangle and let's talk about what are the barriers or things that we are struggling with. Are there any questions on Zoom? Thumbs up, thumbs up. A link to the slide that goes directly to the participant folder is in the chat. So about 10 minutes, okay?
Tell me one more time, like explicit directions, what they should be doing. The triangle template.
Well, so just really quickly, I want each group to tell me 2 things that you would like to work on, because I'm assuming from the conversations I've heard that a lot of those are going to be the same. We're going to hear some themes emerging, okay? Floyd County, do you all care to share just two pieces that you talked about?
Okay.
And if, hang on just a second, Rachel.
I don't need a microphone.
Hang on one second. If the teams on Zoom would go ahead and put it in the chat, and then you all can share out, that would be great. If they can go ahead and drop that in the chat. 2 pieces from their discussion that they would like to work on for their multi-tiered prevention system. Okay, sorry, Rachel.
As you can see, our triangle is pretty intense. We've had some great conversations. One of the 2 things, you asked for 2 things, correct?
Yes.
So 2 things I feel like as a district, the big thing is consistency. Consistency across the district of where we are in our implementation process and how we go about our MTSS system. It may look a little, we've got the same umbrella, but it looks a little different at each school. So bringing everyone to a consistent point. Also, we feel like that our teachers need ongoing training on interventions. That is the missing key for our teachers, is they know that they've got the data that supports that the student is struggling, whether it be academic or whether it be behavior, social, emotional. We've got that data, but pinpointing those interventions, and they need to become intervention experts, and that's really hard for teachers, and that's a daunting task for them. So how do we support them in interventions and go to? So that's 2, but as you can see our triangle, we have many things that we need to work on as a district.
Okay, thank you for sharing. And one thing I want to add to that, and I know that several of your other tables may have had this discussion too, but when we think about those interventions, we definitely want to make sure that our teachers are trained appropriately to implement interventions, but we also want to make sure that we don't have, our data doesn't show that we need such support and interventions, because we're never going to intervene our way out of poor core instruction. So when we look at those data pieces and we look at the criteria for what students should receive a Tier 2 support or a Tier 3 support as far as evidence-based interventions, we have to make sure that that is a feasible number of students when we think about scheduling or anything of that nature, because oftentimes it's that we really just need to strengthen our core Tier 1 instruction in a specific area, okay? So I heard that discussion as well. Thank you. What about McGoffin County?
We mentioned both of those actually, but the two that I'll focus on, I would say like changing a mindset amongst all of our staff that that we're not jumping under 12 different umbrellas, we're under one umbrella. And to see the integration of all of this and not to view it as different things. And that would come through training and practice.
Absolutely. We know that teachers and administrators at all levels, their plates are very full. And so we want to think of MTSS not as adding something to the plate, but just organizing the plate, maybe putting dividers in it or something of that nature.
Right.
So it should ultimately help with all of those things instead of adding something to. Thank you for sharing that. Cordia, Knott County.
As far as Tier 1, we have a lot of good things in place.
Okay. As far as Tier 1s, we have really good resources. Our scheduling is really good. Our curriculum, our PLCs, instructional process. We have our academic screener in place. So those are all pretty good things that we have going for our Tier 1 instruction. Struggling a little bit with the behavior part. We're just now getting, kind of a screener with behavior referrals and things like that. Like we talked about earlier, social emotional and how we're going to monitor that. So those are some things that we need some help with, maybe a screener with that, or we need to get those plans and protocols in place with that. Tier 2, our schedules are really good. We identify our kids, academically really well. We have a little trouble with the school-wide, structures, how that's going to work. Some teachers are doing it, some teachers are not. So we got to get it, K through 12. We need to do that a little better. But
Okay, thank you. Kelly, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'm primarily working with Beaver Creek Elementary, and the biggest thing we have to work on with Tier 1 is first and foremost is we have to get Tier 1 reaching 80% of our students, or as close as possible. And I think maybe the reason we're not doing that is maybe a lack of monitoring, and we need to develop an action plan on getting our Tier 1 reaching more students, because we have almost an upside down triangle, and it's too many students to have to deal with Tier 2 and Tier 3.
So strengthening core Tier 1 supports, okay.
Or Tier 1, and then with Tier 2, I think the thing we have to work on the most is developing individual learning plans for the student based on each individual student's needs.
Okay.
Using qualitative and quantitative data.
So making sure we're looking at multiple data points and triangulating data instead of using one source, okay?
Yeah, and throughout all of it, as I think someone else had mentioned, we need research-based strategies to embed those in those plans.
Okay.
With those students.
Okay, thank you. Let's go down here to Letcher County. Did they drop anything in the chat?
I do have something from Letcher. I'm currently not in the Zoom meeting right now because I got kicked out, so I'm trying to work back in. So, but I guess it's okay to share. Is that cool?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Luckily, I have it here and not in the Zoom chat. So, one thing that they had said that they were going to, they had some one of the positive things that they had were the academic tiered supports in their district. They felt like that they were on the right track for that. One of the things that they wanted to work forward on that would be consistency across the whole district to ensure, that that's all being implemented. And one of the things also was they wanted to focus on the SEL and behavior aspect. That was, of the two, between the academics and the behavior, that was the weaker of the two. But they, they had really good discussions, and they actually have gotten a good plan of where to start and where to go, and kind of a plan on what to do next.
Thank you. Jenkins Independent. Anything?
I'm completely out of the meeting.
Okay.
I tried twice to get back in.
That's okay.
They posted.
Okay, let's see what we got.
Wi-Fi just kicked back on.
Yeah. So Jenkins Independent had posted, they just posted one area that talking about the SEL is an area where we need some work. And there were some other folks that had also posted that they need ideas and supports around SEL. So they contributed to that conversation as well.
Okay. Anybody have anything else before we move on?
And one of the discussions that I heard, I just wanted to bring this out because I thought this was an important point. People were coming to a realization that the tiers are not groups of students. The tiers are levels of support. And, going back to what you said, but it takes a little while for that to sink in, looking at the layers of support, that it's not about how we group our students into tiers. It's how we think about those levels of support.
That's a great point. Absolutely. So we don't ever want to say, here's Jatavius, he's a Tier 2 student. We want to say he's receiving Tier 2 supports, or he's receiving an evidence-based Tier 2 intervention. So somebody have something else over here?
Yeah, Pike County had talked about the consistency across the entire county with implementation, and also training in the strategies and the interventions that they're using, and then just making sure that they have some highly effective standards mastery with next step pacing guides and common assessments. And
So
then
going back to Tier 1 core.
yes, and then going back, and then they had a concern that they're looking for recommendations for a universal screener for social emotional learning and behavioral.
Okay, we can follow up with them if you'll just share that. And then Breathitt?
Professional learning related to layering of the tiers and selecting, implementing specific individualized interventions.
Okay. All right. Anybody have anything else? All right, so when you think about organizing some of these pieces, there are some documents we want to point out that are in the participant folder that are helpful to you at a district from a district perspective, or at the building level, wherever you are, that are oftentimes helpful as you begin working through these things as a team. So this is one document. This is called a snapshot, and there's actually 3 different snapshots in your participant folder. If you would take just a second and go to that participant folder. These snapshots are really a good quick glance instead of reading a 50 to 100 page document for MTSS guidance or MTSS implementation. These snapshots, and I think we have one right here that has some information in it, but they really look at different pieces and parts, the different components of MTSS, and it's broken down into Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. And so I know several districts mentioned we really want to look at or work on what are those evidence-based interventions we're going to provide for, whether it be SEL, reading, math, writing, whatever that looks like. And so this is one way that you can kind of organize those as a district. It's also great for new teachers, new administrators, just a quick glance at what are the pieces and parts. So what is our universal screener we're utilizing? Is there a diagnostic assessment we need to be looking at? What does differentiation look like in Tier 1? What do the strategies, programs, evidence-based interventions look like in Tier 2, Tier 3? So this is called Snapshot. There should be 3 of them in that participant folder. So I would love for you to look at this at some point today. This is probably going to be helpful as you continue planning and you go back to your building or your district. We're not going to spend any time on it right now. I just wanted to point that out so that you all could see that. So you have what is on your triangle. We are not going to go back to breakout rooms for your guided notes. If you want to just jot down some guided notes from your triangle, but really when we get to this section for your tiered delivery system action planning this afternoon, you're going to go back to that triangle and look at that, okay? So if you want to add some pieces to your guided notes, that is perfectly fine, but we're just going to move on and not go back to breakout rooms looking at the time. So our next element that we're going to dive into is collaborative problem-solving teams. So, collaborative problem-solving teams, what does that mean to you when you think about it? I want you to think about that just a second. Do we have collaborative problem-solving teams in place in your district, in your building? Is that something you're already doing? Is that something we think we're doing and maybe we don't know if we're doing it well? Where are we with collaborative problem-solving teams? I just want you to be reflecting on that as we talk about it. So when we think about these collaborative problem-solving teams, they exist at multiple levels across the 3 tiers. So we're going to look at 4 levels of teaming that the research supports is best practice for this, and you have all 4 layers of teaming for Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. Teams oftentimes exist at the state, regional, district, school, and grade or content level. So the 4 that we're going to focus on today are district teaming, school level teaming, either grade level or content level teaming, and then individual students. So you may call that individual student a SIT team, a student intervention team, you may call it a STAT team, student teacher assistance team. There's lots of different words, acronyms that you may be using for that. And across the state, I think we did a really good job looking at individual student data. What we missed oftentimes was grade level data or building level universal data. So that's one of the pieces that we're going to talk about. So when we look at who is a part of those teams, who's on the team, who's appropriate to be on the team, who are the right people sitting at the table, it needs to be integrated and it should include representation across that level with a holistic focus. So when we talk about holistic focus and whole child, we're talking about academics, we're talking about behavioral health, we're talking about any type of SEL piece. All of those things come to the table when we're talking about holistic focus. Teams will share a common goal that we are all working towards preventing failure and improving student academic, behavioral, and social emotional outcomes. So we're improving outcomes again for that whole child, not dividing it up into let's talk about reading today and let's talk about behavior tomorrow, really looking at all of those pieces holistically. And it allows for maximization of your MTSS structures, whether you're talking about Tier 1 supports, Tier 2 supports, Tier 3 supports. When we look at all of those things holistically, we do a much better job of supporting those students and preventing failure. So here's what our 4 levels of teaming look like. We're going to focus in on, we're going to go from the district to the school, down to the teacher. It could be grade level, it could be content if you're secondary, and student level, okay? So when we think about district level teaming, kudos to Floyd County. They have their entire district team here today. Some of the rest of you all may as well, I'm not sure. But I know that they mentioned they are a district who's been working towards this for a while. They had their district team put together, but because of COVID, there were some barriers. So finally, their district team is all together. They're training together today and are going to be moving towards regular meeting schedules. So when we look at district level teaming, who needs to be on the team? What is the focus of that team? When are they meeting? How often are they meeting? So let's talk about that for just a second. At the district level, typically a superintendent or a designee. Oftentimes it's an assistant superintendent or your instructional supervisor. Those people may be leading that district level team. We always encourage a DPP, our transportation director, your director of special education, your DAC, whoever your assessment coordinator is, and anybody dealing with curriculum instruction. So those are oftentimes our core people who are leading these teams in a district. Depending upon the size of your district, school administrators are critical in this district level team. Now, if you are a district who has 32 schools, it may be difficult to have one administrator from every building at that monthly team meeting. So I want you to think about how are we divided up? How do we get information? What's the communication and data pathway for any information coming from the district level? So when you think about that, If you are a district who has 32 schools, you may choose 2 administrators from the elementary level, 2 administrators from the middle school level, and 2 from the high school level. If you are a district who has 4 schools, it's obviously going to be feasible for you to get all 4 administrators to the table at one time. So you just have to think about that and decide what works best for you based upon your district and your situation. If there is a district MTSS lead or a PBIS lead, you definitely want that person on your team. A lot of districts don't have that position. District behavior specialists, again, there are some districts that position does not exist. If there is someone who is doing that is all we're saying here. And then you really want to think about looking at the whole child, bringing in some other team members. So we've got our family resource and youth service center coordinators or directors. Those people are oftentimes really, really important to have on our team. They have lots of data. They are collecting data on kiddos and families. They know what's going on oftentimes in the community, and they can connect us to outside sources for support or resources. We sometimes have a nurse lead if there is a nurse in every building. When we start talking about kids with high levels of anxiety, they end up in the nurse's office almost every day. Their stomach hurts, their head hurts, they don't feel good, they want to go home. So that nurse data can be really helpful to us. If there is a mental health director, coordinator, lead, if you have a social worker in your district, anyone of that nature who may be providing or working on memorandums of agreement with outside agencies who are providing mental health services in our schools, those people are really important. If there is a counselor lead or a school psychologist lead. So that is a typical membership for a team at the district level. Our focus is always going to be on the MTSS framework, a holistic view of the whole district. So at this meeting, we're never talking about one individual building, we're never talking about one individual student, it's always a district perspective, and we're going to cover all 3 tiers. So we're going to look at data and make decisions based on our data for Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. Oftentimes these teams are meeting monthly. We like to encourage that monthly meetings to start with. You may get to a point in a district where you could meet quarterly, and that would be more appropriate if you're a very large district. But again, those are all district decisions, and it depends upon what you all decide as a district. Completely your all's decisions. Once we move from the district level, we go down into our school level. I've missed a slide somewhere. We go down into our school level. So when we think about the school level and who is on those teams, we want to make sure, obviously, an administrator. It may be the head administrator, it may be an assistant principal, someone who's going to be able to lead that team and make decisions. If there are multiple counselors, you may want to have 1 counselor. If it's a giant school, you may want to have 2, whatever, again, based upon your situation in your building. And then you want to have teachers from cross-representation across the school. So if you're an elementary school, you may want to have 1 teacher from each grade level. If you are a very small elementary school and have like 100 kids, you may want to have 1 primary and 1 intermediate. So you just want to have cross-representation so that everybody has a voice and buy-in on that team as you begin looking at data. If there are any content area specialists, so oftentimes in secondary, when we're talking about middle school, high school, we may have an ELA lead, a science lead, a math lead, whatever that looks like, and typically we talk about how are your PLCs structured. So how does information typically go from your administrator out to your buildings? What is that communication pathway? Thinking about that. And then it's great to have all of the people that we talked about at the district level team. So if you have a social worker, if you have a mental health specialist in your building, if you have a frisky, if you have any of those people, having them on that building level team is critical because of some of the data and some of the discussion that they can bring to the table. When we think about the level of focus, again, we're looking at a holistic view of that building, of the building structure, of the building level data. We are not looking at one specific teacher. We are not looking at one specific student. It is always going to be that universal picture of our data school-wide. We're going to cover Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, and then we're going to build that school capacity. We're going to build the capacity of the teachers. We may make decisions about interventions. We may make decisions about what we're we're going to train for professional learning. We may make decisions about scheduling at that time, but that building level team is always meeting on a monthly basis. You also want to make sure that you have a special education representative on there. Did I miss anybody else? It's great to have a district representative. So if you have your district level team and there's one person leading that, it's great to have a district lead go to those individual building meetings. That way our data is going back and forth, our conversations are going back and forth, and from a district perspective, that's one way that we can monitor that those meetings are occurring and the discussions that should be taking place are taking place. Okay? So then we get down into our grade level or content level. Again, this is all a district decision as to how you structure these. When we think about grade level or content level, we're typically diving into one grade level or one content area of data. So at the secondary level, we may be looking at Algebra 2. Why do we have more course failures in Algebra 2 with our sophomores than any other grade level? What is that about, having those discussions? We may be looking as well at some SEL data. Why are our seniors experiencing increased anxiety? What's that about? What can we put in place to reduce that anxiety that's presenting for those kiddos? What can we do? So that's what this meeting is all about, specifically looking down at the individual grade or content area. So oftentimes with this, there may be an instructional coach on this team. You may be doing this already through some PLCs. Like you may have a monthly PLC where you dig into some type of data. It may be universal screening data one month. It may be guided reading levels the next month. It could be some AVMR math data. It can be all kinds of different data that you're really diving into at the individual grade level. You are looking at that ongoing, and sometimes at that meeting you are determining which students will be receiving interventions and who they are receiving interventions from, or what evidence-based intervention would match their area of deficit. Okay? The last level of teaming is the one I think we're really good at it. How many of you all already have some type of student intervention team in place in your buildings, in your district, that is already occurring, where you look at individual students' data and their area of deficit? Yes, most of us are already doing that piece. So making sure that those teams are meeting on a regular basis. So I want you to be thinking about this. If we look at one individual student and his data and determine his area of deficit, place him in evidence-based intervention in January, is there any reason that we need to look at that student again in January? I want you to be thinking about this. It's not a trick question. Do we need to look at his progress monitoring data again in January? It's great to have that ongoing look at the data, but really when we think about that, what's our time frame? When are we going to make a decision? 6 to 8 weeks. So you need to be thinking about how is that going to work. So we don't have to look at every single individual student and their progress monitoring data on a weekly basis. That could be very overwhelming. You may have someone in your building who is able to do that, but if you don't, that could be very overwhelming. So you want to make sure that you're looking at that data on a regular basis. Well, another thing we don't want to happen is to put a student in an intervention in January and we don't look at any data until May. Okay, so both of those things happen all the time. So we want to make sure that we're not looking at data too frequently, but we also don't want to make sure that we're letting too long of a time span go between looking at that data and making decisions on what is best for those individual students. So those are our 4 levels of teaming. Thinking about what the responsibility is, obviously the monthly meeting, analyzing that data, and again, it's a holistic view. So it's academic, behavior, SEL, any mental health data. You may have trauma data, you're going to have handle with care data. We're going to talk about all of those data pieces this afternoon. And then what are our areas of growth? So when we look at whole school, we can definitely tell. It's our 3rd graders math that's the lowest across the building. So what are we going to put in place to change that data? What are we going to do? You're going to share the data, information, and plans out with that faculty. So whatever, again, your communication pathway is, if it's a PLC structure that you already have in place, you don't need to change everything. You may have something wonderful in place as far as your structures, and you just need to add a piece of data to it. You may need to change the conversation a little bit. So I want you to be thinking about those things. Making sure, we've already talked about this, that there's a shared vision with that team, that we continue that regular meeting schedule, and I know that a lot of districts and teams or buildings had these team meetings going prior to COVID. Then COVID hit and it was really hard to have all of these team meetings virtually as well as teach all day virtually. So I know that some of our districts have changed as far as that regular meeting schedule. So if that's a place where you are, then you may want to be thinking about what's an appropriate timeline for us to get back on track. When do we need to start having these regular meetings again? We always suggest that we create meeting norms, that we have a very structured agenda, that the data is all ready to go. I oftentimes will say to districts, a meeting without data is not a meeting at all. There's no point in having it. So you want to make sure that you have the data there, but it's the right data. You have the appropriate data that's going to help you make decisions. And then you always want to go back to your action plan that you're going to create this afternoon. So making sure, is this discussion focused on what we said our goals were? So we don't want to get sidetracked on some conversation and spend an hour talking about data that doesn't tie or support our goal that we created initially based on our school-wide data or our district-wide data. Okay? Here's a graphic that shows one way that communication can flow between your district and school level teams. So you want to think about your information and data not only flowing down, but also flowing back up. And I think that's one thing that sometimes we don't do well, is oftentimes we push information out or we push data out, but it never has that discussion and then comes back to the district level, or the same at the school level. Sometimes from the school level we push data information out and we don't get that feedback. So really thinking about, this is our communication and data pathway. It's going to go from our district MTSS team down to our school MTSS team. What are we looking at? We're looking at our district analysis and our problem solving process for all different domains in all 3 tiers. You're doing that at the district level as well as at the school level. Here's another graphic. We have a lot of districts who say, we already have all these teams, we already have all these committees. So again, we don't want to necessarily change things that are going well. So you need to think about, what do we have in place that is working for us? How can we adapt? How can we change some of these things? What do we need to adjust? So a lot of districts will have subcommittees. So you may have an academic subcommittee that focuses on core Tier 1 instruction. You may have an academic subcommittee that focuses on evidence-based interventions for Tier 2 or Tier 3. A lot of our districts have a school mental health subcommittee that focuses on all of those pieces and parts that came out of Senate Bill 8, the School Safety and Resiliency Act. So we know, according to that legislation, we're required to have a trauma team in every building. We're required to have a threat assessment team in every building. When are we looking at that data? So if you have this subcommittee, there's no sense in having 6 different teams or 6 different committees that are looking all at those school mental health pieces. Put it in one meeting. Look at all of that together. Then the data from this meeting is always going to go back to your district meeting or your building level meeting. I'll give you just a second to kind of look at that. Any questions yet? Okay, one of the things that we want you to be thinking about is, what teams do we have in place? What do we have? What do we need? What do we need to adapt? What do we need to change? And it may not be a decision that you make today at all. It may just be discussion on what you think would work or what you think would not work, okay? So when this is our chart. This is also in your participant folder of our 4 different levels of teaming. It has the membership, the focus, the purpose, and the frequency. There is also a chart that has the membership column cleaned out for you all. So there's a third chart that is completely blank. It's a completely blank template. So one of the things that we would like to do before we break for lunch is, I really want you all to be thinking about and discussing, what do our teams currently look like? What do we want our teams to look like? How do we want that structured, okay? So you have this with all the information in it. You also have one that still has the level of focus and the purpose in it for you to review if you want to focus on this one. And then you have this one that's completely blank. Here in just a few minutes, we're going to have a little bit of team time and we're going to have some discussion around this. But those are really the big pieces that I want you to be thinking about. What do we already have in place? What is working well? And what do we need to adjust? Okay? Another piece that you have, or another document that you have that may be helpful, we're not going to dig into this today, but this is something that you would want to do with your district team, with your district leadership team, or with your school leadership team. This is really a team organizational worksheet. So you wouldn't be shocked at the times that we go in to support, or we're working with a district, or we're working with a school, and they'll say, well, we don't need to do that here because we do that at this team. Well, we do that at this meeting. Well, we do that at this meeting. I'm like, okay, well, let's figure out what meetings and what committees we currently have. A district about 3 weeks ago, we found at the district level that there were 17 teams or committees meeting. It was not a giant district. 17, and about 5 of them were looking at the same pieces of data. So sometimes it's just going back to what do we have in all different places, and are there any of those things that we can combine? Are there any of those things that we need to change? So just because we've had a committee or a team meeting for 10 years doesn't necessarily mean that has to continue, unless it's part of a regulation, of course, or something of that nature. So I just want you to be thinking about what is going to be most helpful to us, because again, we don't want people to have to meet 6 times to talk about the same piece of data. If we could do that at one time, that would be much better for us, thinking about our time, our resources, and our staff that we have across the district or in buildings, okay? So you have that one as well. You have all 3 of those. This one is a team communication plan. You can look at this one as well. This is after you get your team established and after you have your action plan established. But this team communication plan really talks about data. So it talks about what data is our district team going to look at, what data is our building team going to look at, what data is our grade level going to look at, and then it talks about who they're going to communicate that data to. How do we know data is getting out to parents as appropriate? How do we know data is getting out to the staff in our building appropriately, and how do we know it's going back to the district level? So that's what this team communication plan is. Our recommendation is that you don't create a team communication plan until you are about 6 to 12 months into really rolling with MTSS. So it's not something you want to create up front, because this may change a couple times. So you're really going to focus on this organizational worksheet and this, your teaming structure, okay? So let's spend about 10 minutes. You guys have these documents in your participant folder. We'll answer any questions you have. And then, Jennifer, are there any specific directions before we come back for lunch for Zoom people? Like, I know, do we need to say anything to them at this point?
No, they're going to do their 10-minute activity, and then we'll tell them that we'll break for lunch.
Okay, so let's try to come back together at 11:55, okay? So you have until 11:55 to look at this team worksheet.
And with the district team to talk about the district needs.
Okay, what did we find at the district level? What were some of the discussions there?
We talked about each team that we have, our district team that we have in place, and the teams that we have in place at our schools. And we do have, sit teams in place at all of our schools. We talked about the frequency of those meetings, and, when you think of schools, and we think a great takeaway for today is how our teams how they connect together, our TIC team and our trauma informed and our threat assessment team and our SIT team, and that we need to start being more time proactive and work smarter and not harder, and be very intentional in planning those meetings and how we can bring everybody together in a setting and take care of those needs. So that's been a big takeaway for us.
That is awesome, and I promise you, when you start looking at that data for your kids who have high numbers of office discipline referrals, they're flagging on your universal screener. You're getting the most handle with care referrals on them. You also have some other piece of mental health data. It's going to be the same kids. And so there's no sense in having 6 meetings when we can do it in one. Absolutely. Great point. Anything from your all's individual building perspective that you want to share? It's okay. That's okay. What about right here?
We just talked about how to just try to identify our groups, seeing which would fit our school the best to match up with our district. It's just trying to get those groups together to see. We don't want to have, like you said, 6 different groups or whatever, so trying to identify those groups would be the start where we need.
Anything different from the district perspective? The same, okay. What about from our Zoom teams? Letcher.
Ledger had the discussion about focusing on the school level teams. They were thinking about each school has an admin team already established, so they thought about just making the focus of some of those meetings being MTSS, kind of like I think one of the other districts that talked about working smarter, not harder, because you already had that team formed. Some of the work is kind of similar, and they can overlap, so they were going to just focus that more on MTSS with some of that work.
Okay.
Because Jenkins is a small district, one thing they were looking at was that, everything is pretty much known. I mean, they have their team in place, but now they identified those places where the team has not been meeting all those needs, and so that now they're trying to create a plan and how to bring those resources together to meet those needs.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Pike County was just talking about, they have several things in place in different over time, and so just going back and restructuring and renaming and pulling together, and then also focused on they're in the planning stages of the district level team, and they're real concerned about equity there as far as making sure they get representation from all their geographic areas, and as well as from top to bottom with your K through 5s, your K through 8s, your high school, and then even your vocational schools, your
Alternative
North Point,
schools.
your alternative schools, and then
Any DJJ facilities
Yes.
you may have in the district?
Exactly. That's that was the discussion.
Okay, that's a great point. I'm glad they shared that. Thank you all, Pike County.
I crashed Breathitt County. They had some amazing conversations. They have a strong kind of district MTSS team in place, and they have school level MTSS teams, but they said that there's some variation among the schools in terms of their strength of implementation. And so they talked about how they already have existing principal PLC meetings and how they're going to use that time to share what the schools that have some strong implementation, what they are doing, and let those others kind of learn from each other, since they are serving the same kind of students from the same district, sharing those models. But then we got into some really specific conversations that I think probably a lot of people have already kind of jumped into, is about how this is really connected strongly to the work that they're doing around learning acceleration.
Absolutely.
And how they have new teachers and inexperienced teachers who really need support around developing those grade level aligned learning targets and success criteria, because really, Tier 1 hinges on that, of making sure that we're at grade level. So they really talked about some work around that. So they had some great conversations.
Okay, thank you. Absolutely. That unfinished learning and that learning acceleration is a big part of this work right now, for sure, for everybody. Anything else? Any other pieces of discussion that came up that you want to make sure we discuss or share? Okay, I know we are past lunchtime, so I apologize, but it's just like 6 minutes. So I'm going to let somebody besides me tell you all what the directions are and how that's going to work.
Okay, so those of you that are still virtual, let's still plan for 12:45 because we're not too far behind. Let me take this mask off for 12:45. But what we'll do is lunch is provided for you guys. We've got lasagna and salad. There's 2 lines. One is for lasagna, one is salad. And if you'll go out this door, come back in that door. You guys are pros at masks, but of course we got to take those off to eat. Am I forgetting something? I am. Oh, KVEX staff is going to be serving you out here, so you can just basically walk through the line, okay? But
And everybody gets both lasagna and salad.
that was the next question. I'm sorry that I said that in such a way. You can have both, but I think they're trying to allow you to get through lines a little quicker that way. But yeah, thank you, Jennifer. Okay, we'll break till 12:45.
Am I on now? Okay. Well, I don't know. Are we? Okay. Are we back on Zoom, Jennifer?
Well, I mean, I've got a menu.
Okay. Okay. I think we'll get started in about 30 seconds. Do we need to do anything or wait?
Next breakout. Do we have a few minutes? Or is it immediate?
No, not immediately.
Because they're not in here yet. We can go ahead and start, and I can be wrangling them up.
Okay. So we want to thank Johnny for providing that really big, heavy lunch. So now everybody's going to fall asleep in about 20 minutes, right?
share about the schedule consultation?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
It's got a form in the participant handout.
Oh, you want to share that? Sure. Yeah, sure.
Something I was going to share with you is, I think we put it in the invitation with the MTSS, and you may already know about this, but October 29th, we've already got scheduled. Jan and Megan set aside that date to do like 30-minute Zoom consultations with districts that would like to do that. And inside your participant folder, there's a folder for October 29th scheduling, and it's got a shared doc for Excel that, a Google doc that you can just simply add in your district. I just need one person to do this though from your district, so whoever your MTSS contact or whoever's planning to do that, enter that in, put the contact and the email, and then that way we can follow up with you. But it's 30 minutes starting, I believe, around 8:30. It's in the schedule, and it goes through the day till about 4:30 if I remember, or 4. But you'll see those times listed, and you can choose a time that would work for you. But you can schedule that ahead of time, and it might be fine to do that today. That way it doesn't, you don't lose that. And we'll follow up with a Zoom link, but there is a Zoom link actually on that schedule, on the doc. And so you can share that, but I'll send out calendar invites and so on if you do select that.
Okay, anything you want to talk about being overwhelmed? You want to talk about that now?
Maybe we'll do it right before we break into.
Okay. Okay, we're going to jump back in and we're going to move into database decision making. When we think about database decision making, there's a lot that is encompassed in these next two elements we're going to talk about. But really with our database decision making, the efficacy of that really hinges around our teaming. And so we really have to think about the appropriate team is in place in order to make the appropriate database decisions. So when we think about database decision making, we also are talking about comprehensive screening and assessment. So one of the pieces that is super important around MTSS is our universal screening. So when we think about universal screening, that tells us which students are meeting benchmark, which students are struggling, which students are struggling in specific areas of deficit. So what does that look like across our district or across our building? So we really want to make sure that our universal screening process is in place, appropriate. Universal screening is in place, and then we have a protocol, a procedure for looking at that data. So diving into that, data systems ensure that we are using valid and reliable assessments. Again, I think I have talked to every one of you and know what universal screener you are utilizing. So all of you are utilizing an evidence-based academic universal screener. Some of you are in the place where you're looking for a universal screener for behavioral health or for social competencies. So you might want to be thinking and discussion lead more on that side of things. Are we implementing those with fidelity? So are we giving those assessments the way they were designed to be given? Are we giving the appropriate time? Are we giving the appropriate supports or the appropriate setting? Whatever that is for each one of those. With all of these pieces, data should be collected, analyzed, and then used to make decisions. Multiple data sources ensure triangulation of data. So again, we go back to, we're not just looking at one single source of an assessment, but we're looking at multiple assessments from multiple places to ensure that when we are placing students into some type of support or providing them with an evidence-based intervention, that it is appropriate for their needs. Not just that maybe they had a bad day that day and they didn't score so well on one assessment, or they've really had a bad weekend, they've lost someone in their family, and they come in and behavior presents. So we want to make sure that we're looking at multiple data points across different time spans. And then we really need to have assessment plans in place. How many of you all can say with confidence in our district or in our building we have some type of assessment plan? We know when we give what assessment. We know when the window opens. We know when the window closes. We know what to do with that data. We know that it goes to this person at the building level and then it is sent to someone at the district level. We know that we get a report back or whatever that looks like. So really those assessment plans are important once we get all these pieces in place, making sure that we all know which assessments we are giving to which students, how that data is being tracked, and that we're utilizing that data. You would be amazed at the number of times that we are looking at universal screening assessments in buildings or in districts, and teachers are not even able to get into that assessment system. They don't know their login. So we know that they haven't been taught, the professional learning has not been in place in that district or in that building for them to learn how to look at that data, as we were talking earlier about some of that data literacy.
Megan, something that we did this summer, kind of knowing where we were going to be this year, is we led our districts through a training or a professional learning session to conduct an assessment audit. And they did a lot of that. They identified all of those assessments that they had in place. What were they using? How were they using it? How was the data being shared? How was the data being utilized? And they found some districts found some that could be taken off their plate because they really weren't using the data, or there were other assessments that were giving them better data or replacing that data. So it was a good exercise. So we went through that this summer, and many of these districts participated. So
great, thank you. So yes, making sure that we have the appropriate assessments is key when we're talking about database decision making. And again, it's going to occur at all levels of teaming. So we're looking at that database decision making at the district level, at the building level, at the grade level, student level, content level, all of those pieces. And then we will eventually in districts get to the place where we have decision rules. What is the criteria for students? What is our benchmark? What is benchmark for behavior, for number of office discipline referrals? Or criteria for an internalizing, externalizing screener? What is our criteria? What are we looking at there? And then what is our criteria and what are our decision rules about when a student is moving into a support at Tier 2, then what does that look like? We have 3 weeks, we have 4 weeks of not meeting the aim line, the trend line. So making sure that we are literate in being able to read the data, we are literate in being able to discuss and analyze that data and know what we need to do in all levels of teaming, from the district all the way down to the individual student. So when we think about some of the different data sources that we may have, that we may be utilizing specifically at the district and building level, we start talking about needs assessments. We start talking about universal screening. Again, for all different domains, do we have a universal screening process in place for all domains? Sometimes we need a diagnostic assessment to dig down a little deeper and tell us, we see a kiddo doesn't meet benchmark, but sometimes our universal screeners don't always tell us what the specific area of deficit is. And so that diagnostic assessment really would dig down a little bit deeper, and it may tell us specifically it's numbers and operations for math, or it is a fluency issue, or it's a phonemic awareness issue when it comes to ELA or reading. So those diagnostic assessments are very helpful and are utilized in a lot of buildings and a lot of districts to make decisions for intervention. Are we utilizing formative assessments, progress monitoring? And when we talk about progress monitoring, we don't get into that deep today, but we want to make sure that we are utilizing evidence-based progress monitoring tools. A weekly assessment, such as a spelling test or something of that nature in the classroom, is not an appropriate progress monitoring tool. So do we know what those are? Do we know where to find those curriculum-based measures? Do we know how to implement those? Early warning tool, did we talk about this earlier? How many of you all are currently utilizing the early warning tool in some capacity within your building or district? Anybody at all? So the early, do you want to talk about this, or do you want? Okay, early warning tool is a tool that's available through the Department of Education, through Infinite Campus. So you are able to go in, it has a formula that looks at lots of different pieces. It will look at grades, it will look at the number of times a student's phone number has changed, the number of times the address has changed, the number of times they've moved from school to school or district to district. It looks at attendance. It also looks at office discipline referrals, and it gives them a risk ratio or a score. And so you can look at who your kiddos are that, based on that formula, are at your highest risk. And so you can really identify some subgroups that you would be able to say, we need to provide something for these students or this group of students. And then you may also be utilizing some type of culture climate survey. You may be utilizing the impact survey. What are some of those other surveys that could be sent out specifically to one building? Could be staff, it could be families, it could be communities. So lots of different data pieces when we talk about that comprehensive screening and assessment with database decision making. So with our 4-step problem-solving process, this is going to look very, very familiar to lots of you. Really, we're looking at problem identification, problem analysis, planning and implementation, and then evaluation. So when we think about those things, the graphic over here says that we have to first decide what is the problem. We're looking at our data and determining what is the problem. Then we have to dig a little bit deeper and we say, well, why is this a problem? If this is it, then what causes it? What is the underlying root cause analysis for that problem? Then we decide what we're going to do about it. Are we going to change something in core instruction? Are we going to change the way that we are providing intervention for students? Are we going to change student groups? Are we intensifying intervention? Are we just changing a tier 2 intervention? So what are we going to do about those pieces? And then we have to look at data, which is typically our progress monitoring data, as well as our ongoing universal screening data, to determine if what we did in step 3 worked. So we're always going to do these 4 steps in each level of intervention. So when we look at this at tier 1, we're looking at whole school, whole district. We're looking at these pieces across the district. When we get into looking at individual students in tier 2 and tier 3, then we are looking at the individual kiddo and what that data supports for that individual kiddo. Then what are we going to put in place? What are we implementing? What's the intervention? Then we're going to look at the progress monitoring data to determine, was it effective? Did it change that data or not? And then what are we going to do about this? So this is it's ongoing. This never stops. So let's stop for just a second. I want you all to think about, does this look like anything else that you're used to doing or used to seeing or similar to anything that's going on in your buildings or districts? Anything at all? Is anybody familiar with the root cause analysis protocol? It's very similar to that. It's also very similar to our PDSA cycle. So it's very similar to all of those, and all of those are examples of a 4-step problem-solving process. So when we think about these 4 steps, we're really doing the exact same thing at all of those levels of teaming, okay? When we think about the comprehensive screening and assessment, there are a couple different pieces we want to make sure are in place. Do we have a balanced assessment system? So are we looking at different, again, triangulating that data, looking at different data sources? Do we then have a universal screening process in place? Do we have diagnostic assessment? And so with diagnostic assessment, we don't always need it, but sometimes we do, and we have to know when we do need it and when we don't need it. So if we need that, is that in place? And then we look at progress monitoring. Are we progress monitoring? And again, remember this morning I said it was really kind of 2 sides to a coin. Are we progress monitoring individual students, but are we also progress monitoring the fidelity of our interventions and our interventions overall? So again, if I have 20 kiddos in a tier 2 evidence-based intervention, I need to know how many of those kiddos. If only 5 of those kids are making progress, that's 25% of kids in that intervention are making progress. So it's probably not very effective, and I have to decide why it's not effective. Is it the person that's implementing that? Is it the way that it's structured? What's going on with that intervention, and how can we make sure that we are moving more students to prevent that student failure? This is an example you have in your participant folder. So this is one way, whenever we're talking about looking at universal screening data, we always want to look graphically at that data. So when we look at numbers, we see one thing, but when it's on a graph like this, oftentimes more discussion comes to light. Things come up that may not have come up if we were just looking solely at numbers. So this is an example that, again, is in your participant folder. You can download it. It's also available on the KY MTSS website. Anybody can utilize it for any different subject area. But over here on the right, we have should be. So remember, this is our goal. Our goal is that 80% of our students are meeting benchmark with that core Tier 1 instruction. And then this one, you can actually look at, you could look at reading, writing, math if you wanted to. You could look at progression. So this one looks at fall, winter to spring scores. And it looks at the number as well as the percentage of students who are meeting benchmark fall, winter, and spring. So obviously we want that number at Tier 1 to increase, and we want Tier 2, Tier 3 to decrease. That is our goal always. So it's oftentimes really good to look at this data school-wide as well as individual grade level. Oftentimes what happens if I'm teaching 4th grade and I'm in my classroom and my door is closed, I know that I am teaching my heart out every day and I know what my data looks like. But I may not have any idea what that data looks like for kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade. Or I may not know what it looks like if I'm a K-8 school. I may not know what 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade data looks like. So it's really good to look at this data school-wide, holistically. Where are we? What does this look like for us? Is math stronger? Is reading stronger? Why? What do we need to do to balance those two pieces out? So again, this is in your participant folder, and anybody can utilize this that you would like in any way you want, really. This is another way that you may look at data. This is some, it's a data example, even though all the percentages are X'd out, from what is called the SRSSIE. It is a student risk screening survey with internalizing and externalizing behaviors. So this is one example of a free screener that is available for behavioral health, for behavior. It looks at internalizing behaviors and externalizing behaviors of students that they are presenting in classrooms or in school settings, and teachers are able to score them on a Likert scale. So this is an evidence-based screener. Again, it's free. That's the reason we're sharing this with you. But you can very easily see how we could drop our data into that chart, and then that data could be also put into these triangles just like this, into graph format. When it's in graph format, it's very easy to compare. We're looking at grade level to grade level, we're looking at building to building, or we're looking at academic, behavior, and social emotional. So it's really good to put those 3 different domains together. Again, a holistic perspective. Anybody have any questions about the SRSSIE? About that screener? Okay, since we spent a little more time this morning, we are just going to spend about 5 minutes. I want you to go back to your guided notes. I want us to look at the database decision-making section, and I want you to have some discussion around what pieces you feel like you're doing well, what are the things you need to work on, what questions do you have. Okay, so we're going to go to breakout rooms for about 5 minutes, and then we'll all come back together and start on our next element. That work? Okay, so go back to your guided notes. Sheet is not in that folder. We will drop it in there, okay? So we missed that one. I missed that one. So we'll drop it in there in just a little bit. Let's start back here with Floyd. What were some of the big data pieces that you all talked about? Anything come up that was...
Anybody else?
We just talked a lot about we talked a lot about how that we have a huge turnover in staff, new teachers and things, and how that we need to make sure that they're aware of all the universal screeners and all of the assessments that we are utilizing, and knowledgeable about what each of those assess, and so that they can, help in making those data-driven decisions, and also, determining the criteria in order for us to, make changes.
Okay. That's a great point. Lots of new staff and lots of new administrators everywhere as well. So making sure staff and administrators really know what are all the data pieces and what do they assess. That's a great point. Anything up here from individual schools with McGoffin County? Anything big come up in your all's discussion? Okay, what about district perspective?
From a district perspective, we talked about how at the school level, we kind of already talked about how everybody was doing something a little bit different, but the grade level seems to be there. We have all the pieces, we're just not cohesive with things, and looking at it from the holistic approach, bringing that data back together before we can restructure and make improvements and then move forward.
Okay, so oftentimes we have all the puzzle pieces, it's just putting the puzzle together, right? So all the pieces, absolutely. What about Knott County?
We feel like this year we've done a really good job of taking the data we've got available and really breaking down and seeing where those gaps are and those weak points are, and focusing on making the best decisions moving forward that we can.
Okay. What about district perspective? Anything different looking at data from a district perspective there?
The only thing that I could add is this year we have been looking at multiple sources of data instead of just putting all of our eggs in one basket.
Okay.
And trying to pinpoint exactly where our kids are and pick a few common themes that's maybe throughout, and then having teachers work on those with their students during intervention time.
Okay. All right. And I know we've lost a few people this afternoon with our breakout rooms, but anything big coming out of the breakout rooms that anybody would like to share? There were some other obligations and districts that people were attending, I think. So anything out of Pike County?
Pike was just saying that they feel like they have the data, but that lots of their practitioners are just surface users of the data. They're not diving below the surface, and they're really having a disconnect in matching the intervention to the diagnostic and what the diagnostic's showing.
Very common, very, very common issue across districts.
And Breathitt County Schools, out of the last breakout, enhancing their ability to drill down to the skill that the student actually needs.
Okay.
And that's a process, looking more in depth at the data, becoming critical consumers of the data.
Okay. Thank you. Any other data pieces? Any other big data questions that we want to address? Too much lasagna. All right, moving into evidence-based practices. So evidence-based is key and critical when we start thinking about what we're providing to students in all tiers of prevention. So when we think about instruction and intervention, really in Tier 1, we're talking instruction, core Tier 1 instruction with some differentiation to meet students based upon the needs, and then really moving into Tier 2 and Tier 3, we're thinking about those evidence-based interventions. So we want to start thinking about what practices, what strategies are we utilizing. Do we know what those are? Do we need to do something of an initiative inventory of sorts? Do we even know what's being provided to students across a district or across a building? And then how do we ensure that those are evidence-based and that our teachers who are providing those, or whoever the support staff is that are providing those, have been trained to implement with fidelity? So there's a lot of different layers when we start talking about evidence-based instruction, intervention, and supports. So when we think about this selection process, that's kind of where that brings us. How are we choosing these interventions? Is it just something that we had available that was free? Is it something that we've used for 25 years? Why are we using this intervention? What is it? Why are we using it? And is the evidence and the research behind it to support it's something we should be using with our kiddos? So thinking about the selection process, it's oftentimes led by leadership. It considers student equity and the data with a focus on prevention. There's that word again. We have to ensure that there is a plan in place that we're following through with for training and coaching to make sure that those interventions are delivered with fidelity in each and every tier. So if we go back to look at our data and we determine we have a core Tier 1 instructional issue, then let's look at core Tier 1. Number one, what are we delivering? Number two, is it being delivered with consistency and fidelity? And if not, that's what we're going to fix first. I said this earlier, but we're never going to provide enough intervention to intervene our way out of poor Tier 1 core instruction. That's never going to happen. So are those provided in the appropriate ways? And then are we making decisions on the data that are aligned with our improvement goals and initiatives? So making sure that we're going back to what are our improvement priorities? What are our goals? What does our action plan say? What are we focused on? And making sure that all of those align with one another. Oftentimes when we're looking at multiple levels of data, it can get a little squirrely on what are we focusing on right here. So making sure that all of those are aligned from the district level teaming to the building level, student level, and our PLC grade level. So making sure that we have alignment with all of those pieces. Do we have any type of formal process in place for selecting those practices in all tiers? What does that look like? Is there a committee? Is there a process? How are we making those decisions? And then have we provided that training and coaching? So training is one thing, and I know that everybody in this room will understand this, but when we go to a training and they say, here it is, this is how you do it, and then nobody ever talks to us again about it, nobody ever monitors what we're doing in classrooms or in buildings, it's oftentimes not going to be implemented with fidelity. So when we think about that training, that's the first piece, that professional learning or training around that, but you have to provide follow-up coaching and support and monitoring. And are we looking at the data? Are we going back when we get someone new on board and adjusting those different pieces? Let's train that person. So making sure that there really is some type of formal process in place for that ongoing support is going to be really important when we think about this. And then are we using fidelity measures? So oftentimes, we provide evidence-based interventions that there is a fidelity measure for, and we don't ever look at the fidelity measure. So looking at what are we providing within our building, within our district, is there a fidelity measure available? And if there is, are we utilizing it? If we're not utilizing it, why are we not? Maybe it's something that we're not ready for. Maybe it's something that we are training on, but really making sure if there is one available and we're not using it, we know the reason behind that. Thinking about the effectiveness of instruction and intervention. That's what we've talked about all day with the data as far as monitoring what percentage of kids are making progress. Just like you're monitoring with that universal screener 3 times a year. Making sure that that integrated team is utilizing multiple data sources is going to be important, and that we're setting measurable goals, appropriate measurable goals for kiddos. We see all the time the kiddo's goal is we need him to meet benchmark. Well, if he's at the 3rd percentile and benchmark is the 50th percentile, we're a long, long way from benchmark. So are there other goals that we can put in place that would be more appropriate, aligned to the area of deficit? We want him to increase comprehension from 60% to 80% to 90%. You know, what does that look like? So are those goals very specific and matched to that area of deficit? Then are we also looking at the instruction and intervention and how we're progress monitoring at that systems level? So we can progress monitor at the student level and at the intervention level, but if we're not monitoring our building-wide system or our district level system and something drops, there's 1 or 2 things that get dropped, then oftentimes the data will begin to have gaps in it again. So really making sure we're progress monitoring at those 3 different levels is really important. Thinking about that equity and access that we talked about early this morning, making sure that Tier Core 1 instructional practices fit the cultural context of our students, and that Tier 2 and Tier 3 is exactly the same. So what group of students? Do we have a subpopulation or a subgroup of students that need Tier 2 interventions and supports or Tier 3 interventions and supports, and is what we are providing them appropriate for the cultural context of that subgroup of students? So that's something you might want to begin thinking about if you're not in that place where you've thought about that previously. A continuum of those evidence-based interventions that are culturally responsive is really important too. So if you remember that snapshot that we looked at earlier, it had a list of 5 to 6 different evidence-based interventions. So what is our continuum? This is intervention 1. If this one is not successful, then do we have a continuum? Do we know where we're going to go with that support? Do we know what comes next, what comes third, what comes fourth, whatever that looks like for us in a building or district, but do we have that continuum of supports? Instead of just saying, we're going to provide this one intervention, and if that doesn't work, sorry, we don't know what else to do, okay? Making sure that we have something that comes next. What's more intense? What's our next level or next layer of support, and what does that look like? I don't know, Jan, do you want to share anything about any of the ESSA levels of evidence and how that's kind of broken down on the website for anyone?
I was actually thinking more about this is an area that you might want to dig a little deeper into in that implementation guide, because there's a section in there that talks about the levels of evidence from ESSA. Typically, most kids at Tier 1 are going to do okay with those levels 1, 2, and 3. Usually when we move up with intensity of focus and intensity of intervention, we're looking at more level 1 and 2 type of interventions. And then when we move into Tier 3, we sometimes have to tweak something, so it's a little more individualized. And so then you might really move into looking at not only trying to start with levels 2 1 and 2, but you also might look at just the level 4. Is there a research base behind it? So I think there's a section in there that talks a little bit about that, of looking at the levels of evidence by tier. It's just a nice thing to kind of refresh yourselves on. And there's also a section that comes from some of the work that Matthew Courtney's done with this, where we also just talk about the selection piece. And to me, when I worked at a district, that was the hardest thing, is thinking about how we selected those interventions. And so there's a matrix in there that talks about several things to look at. And I think looking at, does it fit? Does it fit the area of need that you've identified? Does it fit the cultural and contextual needs of the school or district? Do you have the capacity to implement it? And so what does it take in terms of, time, staff, training, and then does that intervention have that support, like Megan was saying? Is there a professional learning support with it, so that you can look at that broad base of how you're selecting your interventions to see if you can actually implement it? And then looking at the fidelity piece, there are key components to every intervention that needs to be in place. And I know a lot of times we shudder at the word fidelity because it kind of has some connotations that are uncomfortable for us, but really all we mean by that are the key ingredients of that intervention being implemented. And if they're not, is it a training issue, or is it a staffing issue? You dig into the why a little bit. So I would just kind of say, look into that section. Matthew helped a lot. Matthew Courtney, who did this webpage, helped a lot with preparing that section. And I think it does flesh out a little bit of the questions you might have.
And I think for me, the hardest part about our evidence and looking at those pieces is none of us as educators or administrators or whatever we are in our role, we're trained to be researchers, right? And so when you dig into that research, not only are you looking to see what is the level of evidence, but what's the level of evidence with our student population in our cultural context. And so there's two different layers to that. So oftentimes it's easier to find that evidence to support an intervention or a program or a practice or whatever it is, but then you have to dig a little bit deeper and say, is that going to work with our population of students here in this building or this district or wherever we are? So definitely something we want to consider. We want to make sure that everyone is aware of What Works Clearinghouse and our IES practice guides. This is from our National Department of Education. It's really the biggest database anywhere of all of these different practices, programs. It has some best practice guides. All of those IES practice guides are coming from research. Once you get into that website, it does get a little bit confusing as to where you find things. So your newest, most recently published practice guides are always going to be at the top, but you can filter, you can search, you can sort, you can do lots of different things. So if this is not a website you are familiar with, I would really encourage you all to dig into this at some point, maybe not today, but definitely something to consider. We need to be familiar with this and know where to find that research, and then once we find it, how to read it and interpret it, okay? Anybody have any questions?
I'm also going to go back to telling you again, just remember to go back to the website on the evidence-based practices resource page. We have reconfigured that since we originally released the website, and so you can look at it by domain, and then there's places that you can go, What Works Clearinghouse, quite a few other websites that you can go to that kind of help you search for evidence-based practices. So again, another resource for you to use this afternoon as you're in your team time.
Okay, here's another tool that is in your participant folder. This is called an initiative inventory. And so this is really helpful when we are looking at all of the different programs, practices, interventions that are occurring across a building or across a district. Even in really small districts, we oftentimes find that if we pull administrators or interventionists or whoever the lead is from the building into a district team meeting, we could just have 4 to 5 schools, and we always find that we have different things that are being provided to students in different buildings. So that's perfectly fine, but do we know what's being provided? Do we know where those things are being provided? So really just a district look at what we are doing across the district. If we have kiddos who are transient and they're moving 2 to 3 schools in a school year, and they're in level literacy intervention at school A, is that level literacy intervention going to be available to them at school B? So just thinking about those things. If they are transient and they move, what's the equivalent of that intervention? Are we going to be able to continue that, or do we have to start over in a new intervention? All of those are really good things to be thinking about from a district perspective. So on this initiative inventory, you oftentimes can just put your programs, your lists, your strategies down the side, and then some different things to think about are, who's in charge of this initiative? So where is this coming from? What's the funding source for that? Where is this money coming from? Are we having to pay for this? Is this something we already have and we can utilize for free? And who are we targeting with this? Who is the target for that individual intervention or that program or whatever the piece is? Is it part of our strategic plan? What's the data? And then what is the fidelity measure with that? So really thinking about all of those different pieces, because oftentimes we find that even in 4 schools, we have evidence-based interventions that are being provided that are completely different in lots of different places. How are we ensuring that those are matched to the area of deficit? How are we ensuring they're being provided with fidelity? All of those things are questions that we need to be thinking about and asking, okay? So this is just a tool that is in your drive, or in your folder, I guess. So what I want you to do right now is just go back to your guided notes again and pull up that section that is the evidence-based practices and think about where you are. Where are you as a district? Where are you as a team? What are some things that you heard that you may want to go back and work on later, okay? Let's do about 5 minutes here, okay? 5 minutes, and if anybody needs to take a break in this next breakout room, feel free to get up and take a break or whatever you need to do. So 5 minutes in the breakout rooms. So where are we with evidence-based intervention? Let's talk about that for just a second. Where are we with evidence-based intervention? We're implementing room for growth, okay? What else? Anybody? Evidence-based intervention, where are we?
We're not where we need to be.
Not where we need to be, okay. That's okay. Anybody have anything else? Evidence-based intervention. Going through this element of evidence-based intervention, I will say this. There is nothing easy about this process, about this element, about this evidence-based instruction and intervention. We're talking about all levels, all layers. We're talking about all teaming levels. We're talking about multiple processes for choosing and selecting interventions. And then we're talking about multiple layers for monitoring those interventions. So if someone tells you that it's super easy and here's a quick fix, do not believe them. This is not an easy step in our process, okay? So it is a very valuable step. Once we have this in place, you will probably immediately begin to see your data move. But this is really critical and key. This element of selecting these and then implementing with fidelity is really important when we are talking about our entire MTSS framework, okay? Anything else? You want to add anything? Okay, moving into our very last element, family, school, and community partnerships. This is another place really where Kentucky has expanded the framework just a little bit because we want to make sure that we are including everyone in this partnership. So we know that sending kids to school every day from 7:30 to 3:30 is not going to be enough for what their needs are. We're going to have supports from other places. We are going to have to change lots of things. We know what our data looks like in Kentucky for lots of different things, and it's not always good data. It's not positive data. So we know that it's going to take more than just our classroom teacher from 7:30 to 3:30 on a daily basis to change and prevent the failure for some of these kiddos, whether it's academically, whether it's socially, whether it's behaviorally, whether it's for some mental health supports, whatever that may look like. We know it's going to take a team. So part of the family community collaborative partnership really is between all of those different people, and it's focusing on improving the student outcomes, preventing failure in all 3 tiers. We want to make sure that our teams include representation. So if we have family members, if we have community members, if we have industry in our community that may need to be a part of this conversation, how are we going to include them? How many of you all at the district level were involved in sending in your ARP plans, your American Rescue plans? Think about that section on that ARP plan that said, how are we including our community and collaborative partnerships? What are we doing? So making sure that we are addressing these things across all tiers of prevention. Increases, the research supports that it will increase your positive culture and climate, whether you're looking at district culture and climate or you're looking at individual building culture and climate. And you really want to make sure we're engaging families and communities in all of this work. I know that you all know that sitting in these seats more than anybody. So what are we going to do with that community data if we have it? We're going to collect it, analyze it, and utilize it in a meaningful way. Now, when we start looking at community data, it's like giant data sources and data pieces. So we really have to determine within our district, what do we need? What do we want to use? What's going to be important to us? So I think we first have to start with our student data. So what is our student data supporting? If our grants data district-wide shows that we have a very small percentage of students who are coming to kindergarten prepared and ready, then maybe we target some of those preschool age students. What are we doing from birth to age 4? That may be a community partnership or a community agency that you need to reach out to in some form or fashion. If we are looking at high numbers of students who have some type of addiction at the middle school and high school secondary level, then we may need to look at some of those data sources. What do our Narcan uses look like in our community? What is our overdose death rate in our community? So really thinking about, this is really bringing in our behavioral, our mental health, and our social emotional competency piece. What are the data pieces that really we know our students are struggling with, and what community data will support that we need to do something about that? So lots of different pieces of data that you can utilize in communities. You just have to be very intentional and very strategic about what you're going to utilize and how you're going to utilize it. Do you want to add anything to that?
I'll just tell you, that was kind of an eye-opener for me as a district coordinator, is kind of looking at reaching out to the community and kind of seeing what the data showed and trying to find it, because as Megan said, there's many sources. Sometimes it's real high level, sometimes it doesn't narrow down in depth enough to what's happening in your community. But a couple of sources I'll just share with you that worked well for us. Reach out to your health department. They have a lot of good resources and can hook you up with some data around suicide rates, drug use, different things like that. I reached out to our SROs. They were able to help find me the data sources I could pull to look at drug use, Narcan use, overdoses, so they could help me drill down into that. And then another good resource is one I did link on the website, and it is the Annie E. Casey Kids Count Foundation, and that is a lot of community wellness data. And so you can sort it by state, you can sort it by county, you can sort it by district. And so you can go in there and look at a number of pieces of data. It just kind of gives you a sense of what's happening, and so it also maybe tells you what areas you may want to reach out to community members and have that support for your students in those hours after school. So those are just some ways to gather that data and kind of think about who may have some data pieces that you need.
And then when you have the data pieces you need, you have to think about, now what are we going to do with these? What's our first step with this? So thinking about, do we have a shared mission with our community members? Not that we're letting them decide what it is, but are we sharing what our mission or vision is with some of those people who may be investing in our school district or who may be providing some type of support? Think about your ATCs. Think about all of those different pathways that you have at the secondary level. So lots of those people are oftentimes valuable partners. Do we have a system structure that's communicated? Do they know how our kiddos get into pathways at the secondary level? What does that look like? What are some agencies that maybe could support the underrepresentation of gifted and talented students, if that's something that our data shows is an issue for us? So thinking about lots of different levels and layers and how all those could work. And then making sure that your partners, whoever those community partners are, and whatever data you're using, do they know what your plan is during school, after school, breakout sessions. Some of our most successful districts with MTSS have really created really strong partnerships with community members, and so as part of this learning loss or part of this learning acceleration, they are saying, okay, we have a 2-week break here. What can you all provide? And they have teachers working with outside agencies and outside agencies coming into schools to support. And so they're working very collaboratively to provide additional supports for kiddos to support the learning loss that has occurred. Thinking about the partners on that communication plan. So if you recall, that was one of the things that I said you want to do later was that communication plan and data plan, making sure that those partners are a part of that plan as well, that they're not just an afterthought. So all of those are different directions that you could go. So what we want you to do is just spend about 3 to 4 minutes. I want you all just to brainstorm a list of who are your community partners that you currently have, who are community partners maybe we need to work on, and are we using any data? Are we using any community data? Okay? So let's do about 4 minutes. Community partners. Where are we with community partners? What does that look like for us? What does that look like for us? If the Zoom teams just want to drop it in the chat and you all can share, where are we with community data? Lots of good discussion, I heard. Too much lasagna.
Does anybody with their community mental health partners, are there any data that your community mental health partners bring in that you guys use?
That would be KRCC, correct?
As far as outcomes, as far as, student outcomes based on their interventions that they're doing, their therapies that they're providing, or... That was an area we struggled with, and kind of trying to get those supports in place were a little bit of a struggle.
So do we have a plan? Do we know where we're going with community data? Yes or no? Yes. Any no's? Any questions around community data?
Can I share something, Megan?
Yes, please.
I gotta take this last one.
One of the things that I think that a lot of people start to think about when they're looking at their data is they start to think about individual student data, because a lot of times that data exists, but it exists in random places. So like you're thinking about, so who are my kids that live with their grandparents? Well, I can go find that information, but I don't have it. Like if I'm a teacher, I don't have my class list and know this one, and this one live with grandparents. This one, and this one is in foster care. This one, and this one have, single parent homes, whatever. They don't really think about how to collect that data and utilize it for planning instruction and planning interventions. So KVEC has developed a stack of micro-credentials around teaching rural students of poverty, because that's who we teach. When we talk about evidence-based data, we're looking at how does this research-based practice work in a situation where you're teaching rural students of poverty, and that's a very different population to teach. So one of those micro-credentials that we've created, the first one in the stack, is called Understanding Types of Poverty, and it is designed for teachers. And they can work together on a team with teachers that teach the same kids that they do. You don't have to work on a micro-credential in isolation. So they can work with teachers in that team, and they take the students that they have right now, the list of students that they have, and they collect all the data that they can about those students and put it into one place. They create a data visualization about those students so that they know who lives with grandparents, who has transportation, who plays sports, who takes part in other extracurricular activities, what are they, so that they can start to make those better data-informed decisions about what that classroom instruction looks like for those kids they serve. We have the data, but a lot of times you have to go to Infinite Campus and get some of it. You have to go to the cumulative folders and get some of it. You have to go to the teacher that they had the year before to find out what happened with mom and dad. Why is one in jail and one's disappeared? I mean, you have to go find all of that information. And so to really, this is a great micro-credential to start out the year with, but if folks haven't done it, it's never too late. It's to take and really dig into the to know the students that we have, know that there's different types of poverty, that there is generational poverty that a lot of our kids are born into. They've been, you know, their parents have been on welfare, their grandparents have been on welfare, they've always been poor. But then they're situational. So when the coal mine closes, or when mom and dad get divorced and dad's not paying child support, there's a lot of reasons. And so to understand those types of poverty and where those kids are coming from, and to really have like it's a dashboard basically of who are my kids and what are those data pieces that I need to know about my students in order to make some informed instructional decisions, but then also make decisions about interventions. I mean, if you have a kid who's going home to take care of 3 or 4 siblings after school, they're not going to stay after school for tutoring. They can't. But you can know who those kids are, and you can think about, well, how can we maybe offer some virtual options for that student? Or how can we do something different? You know, let that student come, if they get to school early. They get to school at 7:30. We don't start school until 8:10. So how can we build in some interventions for that student that way? But I encourage you, those micro-credentials right now, because of some funding sources that we have received from different organizations, are free. And teachers can earn professional learning credit by working on those micro-credentials. And then they actually have something in their hand that they can use with the students that they're serving right now. So if that's something you're interested in, get up with me. I will show it to you. I'll explain the process to you. But, you know, sometimes when we talk about data and we talk about looking at the big picture, we have to drill down and we have to look at the individual picture of those students. And we also have to think about how data intersects. So let's look at the students who live with grandparents, who play extracurricular activities, who are poor, who have 3 or 4 siblings. And how do all of those things come into play? Sometimes you just can't look at columns of data. You have to look at how data intersects with each other. So if you think that engaging teachers in really looking at their individual students and where those students are in terms of all of those data points, and you'd like to learn more about those micro-credentials, you know, shoot me an email, whatever. I can jump on a Zoom with you and share it with you. Rachel back there is an expert in micro-credentials. She's like the micro-credential ambassador. She goes around and she's known everywhere. So we can tell you a little bit about them and how they work for professional learning. But I just wanted to share that resource with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move into implementation. We've been through all 6 elements of our MTSS framework. Now, how do we do it? How do we put it into practice? So we're going to give you all a little bit of time to work in your teams in just a few minutes, but we want to go through some really important pieces of implementation and what it looks like. So putting it all together, one of the things that you will see in your participant folder is an action plan. The action plan looks like this on page 1. This is what we would love for you to leave this afternoon with some things in it, with some things jotted down, with a plan of where we're going to go from here. What are we going to do first? What are we going to do second? What do we want to look at in a year from now? Whatever that might be for your district. But one of the first pieces that we look at is what are our different goals around MTSS? So what's our academic goal? What is that for us right now? What about a behavioral goal? And do we have some type of school mental wellness, school mental health goal, an interconnected systems framework goal? What does that look like for us? On the right side of this, you will see that it has data. So the purpose of this action plan is that everything we're doing around MTSS is in one location. So where you see data and you see all of these different pieces, what our recommendation is that you will put a link where that is, that if you pull up the action plan, you click the link, it takes you to that data piece. It takes you to that data source. So lots of different data options. We're going to look at some of those in just a minute for the different pieces, for academic, for behavior, for school mental health. But what data do we decide as a team that we want to look at first, and then link it here and make sure that every time we meet at those monthly meetings, we're going back and we are providing data to discuss and analyze. So that's page 1. Page 2 looks at what's the purpose of this monthly meeting. So again, you can put your norms in here, your meeting norms, but really what's the purpose? What are our guiding documents that we need to link to this? Do we have a teaming document with everyone's name on it with a team from all 6 of our schools? What is our district team? Where is that list? Where are our agendas and minutes from past meetings? Do we have MTSS district guidance? Do we want to link the Kentucky new implementation guide in there? Do we have an individual PBIS plan we need to link? So anything that encompasses that umbrella of MTSS, we put links in this document. You also have on the second page, it says year at a glance. So when you are planning, I know right now today we are getting ready to go into November, but you really could look at what are we going to do January through June for sure. So think about what are we going to do when? If we need to do a fidelity measure, what month is that fidelity measure going to occur? You can put your monthly meeting dates and times on here. If you're doing virtual meetings, you can put the Zoom link on there, whatever you want for that year at a glance. But really making sure that whoever's on that team has access to this document, you can go to one location and find all of the pieces that you need. Then for each of the months, we have a different page that is hyperlinked. There's a bookmark, I guess would be the best way to say that, to what does this agenda look like. We're going to look at an agenda in a Word document in just a second, but what are we doing? We're making sure we know what our goals are. We're reviewing the data. That data review is always going to be on there every single time we meet, and then what are our action items? So based on the data, what are we going to do about it? If we have too many tardies in 8th grade, we're going to put additional staff in the hallway between transitions from our 8th grade hallway. What are we doing about that data? How are we going to change that? Now, that's a data piece that may be able to be changed in 30 to 60 days, where some other data pieces may take 6, 12, 18 months to change. But we're always going back and we're monitoring those different pieces. And when we decide what an action item is, we're then going to say who's responsible for it. That's Megan's responsibility, and she's to do it by December 1st. So all of those pieces are in one place on that action plan. Looking at a meeting agenda. This is a typical meeting agenda for a district meeting. You can notice there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. There are 19 different data sources right here on this example. We're obviously not going to look at 19 data sources every time we meet on a monthly basis. But we can decide as the district team, this is something we do want to look at, this is something we don't want to look at. These are just examples for you all to make some decisions around your teaming and data and what you really want to dig into at the district level. But making sure that we are following that agenda, making sure we are taking notes, we are determining what our action steps are. That's going to be really important. So when we look at academic data, what are our big pieces? Universal screening data. Of course, if there's any state testing data we need to add. Do we have diagnostic assessment data? Course failure reports, intervention tracking data, and then early warning tools. So all of those are academic pieces of data. When we get into behavior, we're obviously going to have our office discipline referrals and our statewide reporting system, pulling that Tableau report on a monthly basis, or you can just pull that down as an ad hoc, either way. We're looking at our universal screening data for behavior. What is that for us? Do we have that? And then intervention tracking for behavior, focused on behavior. Once we get into that school mental health or school mental health wellness, we have lots of different options available to us. So are we looking at and are we utilizing that handle with care data? That's part of that School Safety and Resiliency Act. It's not an option for us to participate in that or not. We all should be signed up to receive those handle with care notifications. Threat assessment data, again, that goes back to Senate Bill 8. We are required to be tracking those. Where is that data? Where are we keeping it? Because the department does not have any recommendation on where threat assessment data should be housed. They say we have to keep it. They say we have to complete threat assessments. We have to use an evidence-based practice or protocol. But there is no recommendation on where we keep that data. So where is it? If I'm sitting at the district level, I want to know how many threat assessments have been completed in each of my 6 different schools. That's really important information. What's coming out of those threat assessments? Are we finding that our threat assessments then end in a self-harm risk assessment, or is it simply a threat assessment? What's the outcome of those? What are we doing with those students? School counselor referrals. When we think about first line of defense for mental health, for SEL, we have our school counselors in our buildings. Are we tracking the number of referrals to our counselors? Are teachers referring? Are bus drivers referring? Are parents referring? Are kiddos referring themselves? So are we tracking that data, and do we know who we're servicing? What are our counselors doing on an ongoing basis with that? Once a school counselor determines this is probably something that's above my head, then they may be completing a referral to a social worker. They may be completing a referral to an outside agency who we have a memorandum of agreement with. Are we tracking those? And then when we have those MOAs or those MOUs with some of those mental health agencies that are coming into our buildings and providing services, I want to know who's in my building. What is your licensure? What therapeutic modality are you providing to my kids? Because they can come in all day long. It's like a revolving door and pulling kids. Do we have a schedule? You're not pulling them out of core instruction. How many minutes are you with them? What does that look like? We oftentimes find that when we begin tracking that data, that we have agencies that may be charging for seeing kids and they weren't ever in the building. They may be sending people to see kids or meet with kids who don't have a licensure. So we want to make sure if these are our most at-risk kids that they are receiving the best supports available for that area of deficit if it is a mental health need. So we want to make sure that we're tracking all of those data pieces. A lot of our districts have something called a School 101 training. So if you are a therapist in my community and you want to come in and provide services to my kiddos, you have to go through this 1 hour, 2 hour training so that you see exactly how you check in. What are the pieces and parts that we do in the office? What are things that you can and can't do with kids? Where is your office? What does that look like? How are we communicating? So making sure that they know what's appropriate for our building and our district and our school. Looking at attendance data, obviously. Your family resource, you service center coordinators have lots of data available. Are we looking at nurse data, and do we have any mental health data from the community or any other community data we want to bring in? So when it comes to this school mental health wellness, there's lots of options. If you are in a district where you are not at the point where you are looking at some of these things, then you definitely want to start with your academic, your behavior, and then be moving into this school mental health wellness. We have found that we had a lot of districts who were looking at a lot of pieces of this, but it was in a silo somewhere over here. It was someone else doing it. We want to make sure now with this integrated system that all of these data pieces that are super important and impact our kids on a daily basis, getting off the bus every single day, every single one of these things impacts kids, that we're looking at these at the same time we're looking at this and we're looking at this. That these are not data silos, that we are looking at that integrated perspective of our school and of individual students. So lots of data pieces. So any questions around data? We're not going to go to a breakout room yet. Just any questions around data? Any clarifications with data? Okay, we have, I don't even want you to go to your guided notes yet. I want you to go back to this. So we have about, can we say 30 minutes? Till 1:45? Will that work, Jennifer? Okay, we're going to spend about 30 minutes. I want you to dig into this action plan. I want you to be thinking about what are the data pieces that we need to link. Are we going to use this? How are we going to use this? Do we already know what our goals are? Do we need to set goals? If we need to set goals, how are we going to set those? How are we going to determine what those are? So I want you to dig into this action plan, have discussion with your teams. We will try to break up and make sure we get to every individual team to answer any questions or help with anything you all have questions around.
Megan,
yes.
Also ask them to be sure they identify someone that's going to share so that as KVEC staff, we can capture this information too, because this really drives the professional learning opportunities and the things that we plan. So we do want to hear what's in their plan so that those two can get aligned.
So let me clarify, Jennifer. Do you want them to share a copy of their plan? Okay. Just verbal. Okay, just verbal. All right. So about 30 minutes, we're going to go ahead and go into breakout rooms if you're in a breakout room or if you're virtual, and if not, you're here in the building. Go ahead and break into your teams, and then we'll be around to different teams, okay? So dig into the action plan. Implementation. Where are we going with the implementation?
Okay, I think everybody may be back from their virtual meetings. We'll just kind of do a little wrap up. It's been a full day of learning and information. I hope we haven't overwhelmed you, but I know you all have a lot of good things already in place and some structures to work with. So we really appreciate the time, your attention, and your engagement throughout the day. As we leave today, just kind of be thinking about, like I said, we overwhelmed you with a lot of information, really thinking about maybe what's important for your next steps, building on what you have, enhancing what you have, leveraging your existing systems is really what we want to kind of focus on as you bring this information back to your district. So one of the things to finish up is we do have a feedback survey. We'll drop the link in the chat. You can also copy it from your agenda. So just take a few minutes and fill that out before you go. And then Johnny, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Yeah, let me just say something about the feedback survey. We do have ELA credit for today, and I know that most in the room can use that. And so the feedback survey has that ELA number within the survey. It's a pre-filled link, so it's already got the title of the sessions, the 6 hours for today and such. And so when you fill this out, don't write over top of the things that are already pre-filled in. And then once you submit this, it's going to send a certificate to your email, and you'll have that certificate to be able to use for your ELA at your district. The other thing I want to mention to you too, remember the October 29th, that you can sign up for 30-minute consultations, Zoom sessions. We've got one district in there right now, but just remember to do that. I'll try to send out a reminder in a few days, and then we'll just finalize that and send out calendar invites to those that have signed up for it. But we've really enjoyed seeing you today, and I hope that this is things that will continue.
Thank you. And remember, any questions that you have, anything you want to drop us a line, my email is jan.sellers, S-E-L-L-E-R-S, @education.ky.gov. You can also reach me through the link on the KY MTSS website. So questions are always welcome. If you've got some tools or resources you have a need for, just let us know. Sign up for the newsletter so you can be aware of any new resources that we add. And then if you have some things that you'd like to share that you think would help other districts, please send those my way as well. And we just really look forward. We're very happy to have you here and look forward to continuing our work together. So thank you so much. And a big thank you to the KVEC team and tech staff. Let's give them a round of applause.